She was too old to be chosen, until a cowboy took her hand at the station in front of all. At 31, Nora Ellison had been rejected 6 times before. Standing on that dusty Wyoming platform in 1878, watching younger women claimed one by one, she knew this was her final chance. Then a storm-eyed rancher arrived late, walked past every fresh face, and chose her. The woman everyone else overlooked. What happened next would silence an entire town and prove that some loves are worth waiting for. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched over another rut in the road, and Nora Ellison's head knocked against the wooden frame hard enough to make her teeth clack together. She didn't complain. Complaining had gone out of her years ago, somewhere between rejection number 3 and rejection number 4, lost in the prairie dust like so many other fragile things. Through the window, Wyoming stretched endlessly. A landscape so vast and indifferent it made Philadelphia's crowded streets feel like a distant dream. The kind of dream you had fever-sick as a child, half-remembered and impossible to return to. Out here, the sky pressed down with a weight that was almost physical, blue and merciless, and the wind carried the scent of sage and something wilder, something that had no name in the refined parlors where she'd once taught piano to merchant daughters. That life was gone. Those daughters were married now, some of them, with children tugging at their skirts, and Nora was 31 years old, riding toward her 7th, her last, mail-order bride gathering. 7th. The number sat in her chest like a stone. Across from her in the coach, a girl named Betsy chattered endlessly, her voice high and bright as new silver. 17, maybe 18, with honey-colored curls that bounced when she laughed. She laughed often. Everything delighted her, the mountains in the distance, the pronghorn that scattered at the coach's approach, even the dust that coated everything in a fine gray film. "Oh, Miss Ellison," Betsy breathed, clutching her handkerchief to her chest. "Aren't you just terrified? I can hardly breathe. I'm so excited. Do you think the men will be handsome? Mrs. Caldwell's letter said there were ranchers and merchants, and even a banker coming. A banker! Can you imagine?" Nora could imagine. She'd imagined it 6 times before. "Try not to set your heart on anyone in particular," she said quietly, adjusting her worn valise on her lap. "It rarely works out the way you hope." Betsy's smile faltered for just a moment, confusion flickering across her pretty face. Then she rallied, reaching across to pat Nora's hand with the kind of thoughtless kindness young people specialized in. "Oh, but you mustn't think that way. I'm sure you'll find someone wonderful. You're so dignified." Dignified. The word people used when they meant old. Nora turned back to the window, watching the landscape blur past. She didn't blame Betsy for her optimism. At 17, the world still felt full of possibility, still felt like it might bend itself to accommodate your dreams. At 31, you knew better. The world didn't bend. You did, or you broke. And Nora Ellison had been bending for a very long time. The first gathering had been in Missouri, 3 years ago. She'd been 28 then, already considered past her prime, but still hopeful in a way that now seemed almost childish. She'd sewn a new dress, pale blue with mother-of-pearl buttons, and practiced her smile in the mirror until it looked natural. When she arrived, she'd been one of 12 women, and the men had circled like wolves assessing a herd. She hadn't been chosen. The second gathering was worse. The third was worse still. Each time she watched younger women, girls really, some of them barely old enough to marry, get selected while she stood at the back, smile frozen, hands clasped so tight her knuckles went white. After the 4th rejection, her sister Margaret had written from Philadelphia, begging her to come home. "This is madness, Nora," the letter read. "You're a respectable woman, a teacher. You have skills. Come home and we'll find you a position at a school, perhaps, or—" Nora had stopped reading. Margaret meant well, but she didn't understand. There was no position. The school where Nora had taught had closed when funding dried up, and the other schools wanted younger teachers, unmarried teachers, teachers who wouldn't leave them in a lurch when they finally found husbands. Because that was the unspoken rule, wasn't it? Women were temporary, expendable. Past a certain age, they became invisible. Well, Nora was tired of being invisible, tired of living in her sister's spare room, tired of the pitying looks from Margaret's friends, tired of watching life happen to everyone but her. So she'd kept trying. 5th gathering, 6th gathering, and now this. the seventh and final attempt. After this, if no one chose her, she'd pack up what remained of her dignity and figure out some other way to survive. Maybe she'd head west to California, find work as a seamstress or a housekeeper. Maybe she'd simply disappear into one of these vast frontier towns where no one knew her, where she could reinvent herself as someone who'd never stood on a platform and been passed over like spoiled fruit. The stagecoach began to slow, and Betsy let out a squeal that could have shattered glass. "We're here! Oh, Miss Ellison, we're here!" Copper Creek wasn't much to look at. A single main street lined with weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left as if considering whether to give up entirely. But after days of travel through empty wilderness, it looked almost cosmopolitan. The station sat at the far end of town, a squat wooden structure with a covered platform where a crowd had already gathered. Nora's stomach clenched. She could see them from here, the men in their Sunday best, awkward in collars and jackets, and the women, at least 20 of them, a blur of pastel dresses and nervous laughter. 20 women. God in heaven, how was she supposed to stand out among 20 women, most of them half her age? The coach lurched to a stop, and the driver, a grizzled man named Tompkins who'd barely spoken 3 words the entire journey, swung down and opened the door. "Copper Creek, ladies. Watch your step now." Betsy practically leaped out, already smoothing her skirts and tucking stray curls behind her ears. Nora followed more slowly, accepting Tompkins' offered hand with a murmured thanks. Her legs ached from sitting, and her dress, her best dress, dark green wool with black piping, was hopelessly wrinkled despite her best efforts. The platform was chaos. Women clustered in nervous groups, whispering and giggling. Men stood in a rough semicircle, some bold enough to smile and nod, others staring at their boots like they'd never seen footwear before. And presiding over it all like a general surveying troops was Mrs. Caldwell, the matchmaker, a formidable woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and a voice that could carry across a canyon. "Ladies, ladies, if you please!" Mrs. Caldwell clapped her hands sharply, and the chatter died down. "Welcome to Copper Creek. I trust your journey was tolerable. Now then, we have a good number of respectable gentlemen here today, all eager to meet you. We'll conduct introductions in an orderly fashion. When I call your name, please step forward, state your age and where you're from, and these fine men will have an opportunity to express interest. Is that understood?" A chorus of nervous "yes ma'ams" rippled through the group. Nora found herself at the back again. It always happened this way, the younger women naturally drifting to the front, their optimism and beauty creating a kind of gravitational pull. She didn't fight it anymore. Let them have their moment. She'd take what was left, if anything was left at all. Mrs. Caldwell began calling names from her roster. "Miss Caroline Shepard." A petite blonde stepped forward, blushing prettily. "I'm 19, ma'am, from Ohio." 3 men immediately raised their hands. Mrs. Caldwell made notes in her ledger with brisk efficiency. "Very good. We'll arrange private conversations after all introductions are complete. Next, Miss Betsy Holloway." Betsy bounced forward, curls gleaming in the afternoon sun. "I'm 17, from Pennsylvania." 5 men raised their hands this time. Betsy looked like she might faint from excitement. It continued like that, name after name, each woman younger and lovelier than the last. The men's hands shot up with depressing regularity. Nora watched it all with the detached fascination of someone observing a play they'd seen too many times. She noticed things now that she hadn't noticed at her first gathering. The way some men only raised their hands for the very youngest girls, no matter what they looked like. The way others seemed to be calculating, studying the women like inventory, probably weighing beauty against practical skills, youth against hardiness. "Miss Sarah Brennan," 20 years old, 4 men. "Miss Elizabeth Hart," 18 years old, 6 men. The roster was dwindling. Nora counted backward, 5 women left, 4, 3. Her name would be near the end, it always was. Ellison, alphabetically cursed to watch everyone else get chosen first. Miss Nora Ellison. She stepped forward, chin up, shoulders back. She'd learned not to slouch, not to apologize with her posture for taking up space. "I'm 31, she said clearly, meeting the eyes of the men assembled. "From Philadelphia. I was a teacher there, and I've experience in..." Not a single hand went up. The silence was crushing. Nora kept her expression carefully neutral, but inside something crumbled. She'd known it was coming, had braced for it, but knowing and experiencing were two different animals entirely. Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat, pen hovering over her ledger. Well, thank you, Miss Ellison. Please step aside. The dismissal was gentle, but it was still a dismissal. Nora moved back to her place at the end of the line, that stone in her chest growing heavier. Around her, she could feel the pity radiating from the other women, and somehow that was worse than the rejection itself. Two more women were called. Both received interest. Both were under 25. Mrs. Caldwell consulted her ledger, then looked up at the assembled men. Gentlemen, that concludes our introductions for today. Now, if you expressed interest in any of the ladies, please approach Mrs. Jennings. She gestured to a stout woman with a kind face, and she'll arrange for proper supervised conversations. Remember, these are respectable women, and I'll expect all of you to behave as gentlemen. A murmur of assent, and then the platform dissolved into controlled chaos as men queued up to register their interest and women clustered together, comparing notes in urgent whispers. Nora stayed where she was, at the edge of everything. No point in moving. No one was looking for her. She watched Betsy get approached by three different men in quick succession, each one younger and more eager than the last. Watched Caroline Shepard blush her way through an introduction with a rancher who had to be at least 40, but looked at her like she'd hung the moon. This is it, Nora thought distantly. This is the last time. After this, no more. The thought should have brought relief, but it only brought a hollow ache. She'd failed. 7 attempts, and she'd failed every single time. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe this whole thing had been madness from the start. Mrs. Caldwell was beginning to pack up her ledger, making final notes. A few men who hadn't found out anyone they fancied were already drifting back toward town, probably headed for the saloon to drown their disappointment in whiskey. Nora picked up her valise. Time to find boarding for the night, then figure out the next stagecoach to anywhere. Anywhere but here. Apologies, ma'am. The voice came from behind her, deep, rough-edged, like it had been scraped over gravel and left out in the sun too long. Nora turned. A horse thundered onto the platform in a cloud of dust, moving fast enough that people scattered. The rider pulled up sharp, the animal's hooves skidding on the packed dirt, and dismounted in one smooth motion. He was tall, taller than any man on the platform, with broad shoulders straining against a work shirt that had seen better days. Dust covered him head to toe, coating his dark hair, his face, even his eyelashes. But through all that dust, his eyes were storm gray and steady, the kind of eyes that had seen things and decided they were worth looking at anyway. Mrs. Caldwell recovered from her surprise first, bustling forward with her ledger clutched to her chest. "Mr. Calloway, you're late. The introductions are finished." "I know it, ma'am," the man, Calloway, said, not taking his eyes off Mrs. Caldwell. "Fence broke out at Blue Mesa. Had 10 head trying to make a run for Nevada. Couldn't leave it untended." "Well," Mrs. Caldwell sniffed, clearly torn between irritation and respect for a man who put his responsibilities first. "I suppose that's understandable, but I can't very well start the introductions over again for one man, even if you are—" "Don't need you to." Calloway's voice was calm, unhurried, like a man who'd learned patience the hard way. "Just need to know, any of these ladies still unclaimed?" A flutter went through the remaining women. Calloway was easily the most impressive man on the platform, not prettied up in Sunday clothes but wearing his work like a second skin, competent and solid and real. Even covered in trail dust, there was something about him that drew the eye. Mrs. Caldwell consulted her ledger with obvious reluctance. "Well, most have received interest, but there are a few—" "Her." Calloway was looking directly at Nora. The world seemed to tilt sideways. She stared at him, certain she'd misheard, certain this was some kind of mistake. Men didn't look at her, didn't choose her, didn't see her at all. But he was still looking, those storm-gray eyes meeting hers across the platform, and there was no confusion in his gaze, no hesitation. "I'll speak with her," he said, "if she's willing." Mrs. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Around them, whispers erupted, shocked, scandalized, fascinated. Here was Grant Calloway, owner of the Blue Mesa Ranch, one of the most successful spreads in the territory, passing over all the pretty young things to single out the spinster schoolteacher at the back of the line. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stand there clutching her valise like a shield. Calloway took a step toward her, and the crowd parted automatically. Up close, she could see he was maybe 40, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow that had healed white against his tanned skin. He stopped a respectful distance away and tugged his hat off, revealing hair dark as creek mud and just as must. "Afternoon, miss. I reckon proper introductions can wait till after coffee, if you're agreeable. Name's Grant Calloway, but most folks just call me Calloway or Grant, whichever suits." His voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact, like he hadn't just turned the entire gathering on its head. Nora found her voice, though it came out smaller than she wanted. I'm Nora. Nora Ellison. Miss Ellison," he nodded, testing the name. "You willing to sit with me for a spell? Got some things I'd like to discuss, if you're of a mind." She should say yes, should jump at this chance. But years of rejection had taught her to be cautious, to look for the catch, because there was always a catch. "Why me?" The question escaped before she could stop it, blunt and graceless. Something that might have been respect flickered in Calloway's eyes. "Fair question. Mind if we sit? Been writing since dawn and my knees ain't what they used to be." He gestured toward a bench at the edge of the platform, under the overhang where the afternoon sun couldn't quite reach. Nora glanced at Mrs. Caldwell, who looked like she couldn't decide whether to be scandalized or intrigued, then nodded. They walked to the bench in silence, the crowd's whispers following them like a physical thing. Nora could feel every eye on her back, could practically hear the gossip being minted fresh. "Did you see?" Calloway chose the old maid. What could he possibly want with her? The bench creaked as they sat, Calloway leaving a respectful distance between them. He set his hat on his knee and looked out at the street, giving her space to breathe, to think. "I'll answer your question," he said after a moment, "but I got one of my own first. This your first time at one of these gatherings?" Nora almost laughed. "No, it's my 7th. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she saw understanding dawn in his expression. "7th," he repeated quietly. "And let me guess, every time they passed you over for the younger ladies." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Every time." "Fools." The word was said so flatly, with such complete conviction that Nora blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Fools," Calloway repeated, meeting her eyes. "Every last one of them. But their loss is my gain, I reckon, if you'll hear me out." He shifted on the bench, and Nora noticed for the first time how tired he looked under the dust and the sun-worn tan. This was a man who worked himself to the bone and didn't complain about it. "I'm 42 years old," he began, his voice low enough that the gossiping crowd couldn't hear. "Built my ranch from nothing over the past 15 years. Blue Mesa, 10 miles west of here. Got 200 head of cattle, good water, decent grazing. It's not a palace, but it's solid. Real." He paused, watching a tumbleweed roll past in the street. "Lost my wife 5 years back. Fever took her in 3 days. We'd been married 10 years, and she was the best thing that ever happened to me. Her name was Catherine." Nora's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Appreciate it." He nodded. "Took me a long time to feel ready to try again. Finally decided last month that the loneliness was worse than the fear, so I wrote to Mrs. Caldwell. But here's the thing, Miss Ellison. I'm not looking for what those other men are looking for." "What are they looking for?" "A pretty face, a young thing they can mold to their liking, someone who'll make them feel like they're still young and vital." He turned back to her, and his expression was serious as a church. "I don't need that. I need a partner, someone with sense and grit and kindness, someone who knows life kicks you in the teeth sometimes, and you get back up anyway." He gestured back toward the crowd of women still clustered and whispering. "Those girls are sweet, I'm sure, but they're looking for adventure, for romance, for something out of a storybook. That's not what frontier life is. It's hard work and long winters and things breaking at the worst possible time. It's beautiful too, don't misunderstand me, but it's not a fairy tale." Nora felt something shifting inside her chest, that stone beginning to crack. And you think I can handle that? I think, Calloway said slowly, that a woman who's been rejected 6 times and still showed up for a 7th gathering has more grit than most men I know. I think a woman who taught school in Philadelphia and gave that up to come west has courage worth 10 pretty faces. And I think... He paused, something almost vulnerable crossing his features. I think we're both too old to waste time pretending. The honesty of it stole her breath. No flowery words, no false promises, just the plain truth offered like a gift. I don't know you, Nora said, testing the waters. You don't know me. That's fair, but I know what I saw when I rode up. I saw all those men ignoring the one woman who looked like she had a backbone. I saw you standing there, not crying, not begging, just enduring, with dignity. He smiled slightly. You remind me of Catherine. She had that same steel spine. Is that why you chose me? Because I remind you of your wife? No. The answer was immediate and firm. I chose you because when I looked at you, I saw someone I could respect, someone I could build a life with, not just a marriage. There's a difference. Nora sat back, her mind reeling. This was happening too fast, too unexpectedly. An hour ago, she'd been ready to give up entirely, to accept that marriage wasn't in her future. And now this man, this stranger, was offering her exactly what she'd been searching for, but in a way she'd never expected. What exactly are you proposing? She asked carefully. Courtship, Calloway said. Proper courtship. I'd like to call on you, show you the ranch, let you see what kind of life it'd be. And if, after a spell, we both think it could work, well, then we'd talk marriage. But no pressure, Miss Ellison. You want to walk away right now? I'll understand. She studied him. This man who'd ridden in late, who'd chosen her in front of everyone, who spoke of his dead wife without shame and offered respect instead of empty flattery. Why do I get the feeling, Nora said slowly, that this is the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me, and it's the most practical conversation I've ever had? Calloway's smile widened, transforming his weathered face. Maybe romance and practicality aren't as different as folks think. Before Nora could respond, Mrs. Caldwell appeared at their bench, ledger in hand and curiosity written all over her face. Well, have you two reached an understanding? Calloway stood, offering his hand to help Nora up. She took it. His palm was calloused and warm, and let him pull her to her feet. We have, he said, and his voice carried across the platform, silencing the whispers. I'll be calling on Miss Ellison tomorrow, if she'll have me. The whispers exploded into full-voice shock. Nora felt her face heat, but Calloway kept hold of her hand, anchoring her. He looked down at her, one eyebrow raised in a silent question. Is this all right? She nodded, just slightly, and saw relief flash across his features. Mrs. Caldwell recovered quickly, making notes in her ledger with sharp, efficient movements. Very well. Miss Ellison is staying at the boarding house tonight, Mrs. Patterson's establishment. You may call on her there tomorrow at a respectable hour. I trust you remember the rules regarding proper courtship, Mr. Calloway? Yes, ma'am. Nothing improper, supervised visits, all of that. He squeezed Nora's hand once, then released it, and she felt the absence like a cold wind. Thank you, Miss Ellison. I'll see you tomorrow. He retrieved his hat, settled it on his head, and walked back to his horse with that same unhurried grace. The crowd parted for him again, and Nora saw more than one young woman watching him with something like regret in her eyes. But he didn't look back at them. He swung up into the saddle, tipped his hat to Nora one more time, and rode off toward the edge of town, dust swirling in his wake. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. Mrs. Caldwell ushered Nora away from the worst of it, guiding her toward a wagon where their trunks and valises were being unloaded. Well, she said briskly, that was unexpected. Grant Calloway is a good man, Miss Ellison, one of the best in the territory. You could do far worse. But, Nora heard the unspoken word. But nothing. Mrs. Caldwell stopped, turning to face her directly. I've been doing this for 20 years, child, and I've learned to trust my instincts. When I saw him choose you, my first thought wasn't, what's he thinking? It was finally, someone with sense. Don't let the gossips poison this for you. Nora's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. Thank you. The boarding house was clean and simple, run by a widow named Patterson, who took one look at Nora and declared, "You're the one Calloway chose. Good Lord, the whole town's buzzing about it already. Come on, I'll show you to your room." The room was small but comfortable. A narrow bed with a faded quilt, a washstand, a single window overlooking the street. Nora set down her valise and sank onto the bed, her legs suddenly shaky. It had happened. After 6 rejections, after years of disappointment, someone had finally chosen her. And not just someone, a man who seemed decent, honest, and refreshingly direct. A man who owned a ranch, who spoke of his late wife with love, who looked at Nora and saw potential instead of age. It felt too good to be true. Nora had learned the hard way that things that felt too good to be true usually were. But as she lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't quite suppress the tiny seed of hope taking root in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, the 7th time was the charm. Outside her window, the sun began to set over Copper Creek, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere out there, Grant Calloway was riding back to his ranch, back to his 200 head of cattle and his solid, real life. Tomorrow, he'd come calling. And Nora Ellison, 31-year-old spinster schoolteacher, would have her first real suitor. The thought made her smile, just slightly, in the gathering dark. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Nora lay in the narrow bed at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Copper Creek settling into darkness. A dog barking somewhere distant, the creak of wooden buildings contracting in the cooling air, voices drifting up from the saloon 2 streets over. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Grant Calloway's storm-gray gaze, felt the warmth of his calloused hand, heard his voice saying fools with such flat conviction it had stolen her breath. She'd been chosen. After 6 rejections, after standing on platform after platform watching younger women get claimed while she remained invisible, someone had finally seen her. Not just seen her, chosen her deliberately, publicly, in front of everyone. The memory made her heart race even now, hours later. The way the crowd had gone silent when he'd pointed at her, the shock on Mrs. Caldwell's face, the whispers that had followed her all the way to the boarding house, a wave of speculation and judgment she could feel pressing against her back like a physical weight. What does he want with her? She's 31 if she's a day. Grant Calloway could have any woman he wanted. Why choose the old maid? Nora rolled onto her side, staring at the moonlight streaming through the thin curtains. The questions didn't surprise her. She'd been asking herself the same thing since he'd ridden away. Men like Grant Calloway, successful, established, respected, didn't choose women like her. They chose youth and beauty and the promise of many childbearing years ahead. They chose fresh starts, not women who'd already lived half their lives. But he had chosen her. And he'd given her a reason that made a strange kind of sense. He wasn't looking for a pretty face to mold. He was looking for a partner with grit and sense and kindness. "You remind me of Catherine," he'd said. She had that same steel spine. Nora pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heartbeat steady beneath her palm. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe that this was real, that tomorrow he'd show up at Mrs. Patterson's door and they'd begin the courtship he'd promised. But years of disappointment had taught her to guard her hope carefully, to keep it small and protected where it couldn't be crushed too easily. Tomorrow would tell. Tomorrow she'd see if Grant Calloway was a man of his word, or if this had been some kind of elaborate joke at her expense. She finally drifted off near dawn, exhausted, and woke to bright sunlight streaming through the window and someone knocking firmly on her door. "Miss Ellison?" Mrs. Patterson's voice, brisk and practical. "You decent? Got breakfast ready and you'll want to eat something before your caller arrives." Nora sat up, disoriented. "My caller?" "Grant Calloway, child. Whole town knows he's coming for you today. Now get dressed and come down. I made Johnny cakes and bacon, and there's coffee strong enough to wake the dead." "Right. Today." Nora's stomach flipped over itself. She washed quickly in the cold water from the basin, then dressed in her second-best dress, a gray cotton with small white flowers that Margaret had made her 2 years ago. It was practical and modest, and it made her look exactly like what she was. A respectable woman past her first youth, sensible and unremarkable. For a moment, staring at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, Nora felt the familiar ache of inadequacy. She wasn't beautiful. Her face was too angular, her mouth too wide, her brown hair too plain. At 31, the first fine lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes, and her hands were beginning to show the wear of years spent working. First teaching, then helping Margaret with her children, then doing whatever work she could find between bride gatherings. She looked like exactly what those men on the platform had seen. An old maid, past her prime, desperate enough to travel hundreds of miles for the slim chance at marriage. But Grant Calloway had looked at her and seen something different, something worth choosing. Don't get your hopes up, she warned her reflection. Not yet. Not until you know this is real. Downstairs, the boarding house's small dining room was already occupied. 3 other women from yesterday's gathering sat at the long table, whispering urgently over their breakfast. They fell silent when Nora entered, 3 pairs of eyes tracking her movement as she took a seat at the far end. Mrs. Patterson bustled in with a plate of Johnny cakes and bacon, setting it down in front of Nora with a knowing smile. "Eat up, dear. You'll need your strength." "Thank you," Nora murmured, acutely aware of the stares. The silence lasted about 30 seconds. So, one of the women, Sarah Brennan, Nora remembered, 20 years old with auburn hair, said with forced casualness, "Mr. Calloway is calling on you today." "Yes." Nora cut into her Johnny cake, keeping her eyes on her plate. "That must be very exciting." Sarah's tone suggested it was anything but. "He's quite successful, from what Mrs. Caldwell said. One of the most eligible men in the territory." Another woman, Elizabeth Hart, leaned forward. She was the youngest of the group, barely 18, with dark curls and a rosebud mouth that trembled with barely suppressed curiosity. "We were all so surprised when he chose you. No offense, Miss Ellison, but you're older than most of us, and Mr. Calloway could have had his pick." "Yes," Nora said evenly, taking a sip of the scalding coffee. "I was surprised as well." "Do you think," Sarah pressed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "that maybe he feels sorry for you? I mean, you weren't chosen by anyone else, and he did arrive late, so maybe he felt obligated." "That's quite enough." Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, wooden spoon in hand. "Miss Ellison is a guest in my house, and I won't have you girls gossiping like fishwives at my table. If you've finished eating, you can go wait in the parlor for your own callers." The women scattered, taking their plates with them and shooting resentful looks at Nora as they went. When they were gone, Mrs. Patterson sighed and poured herself a cup of coffee, settling into the chair across from Nora. "Don't mind them," she said. "They're young and jealous, and they don't understand what men like Grant Calloway actually want in a wife." "And what's that?" Nora asked, genuinely curious. "Substance." Mrs. Patterson took a long drink of coffee, her weathered face thoughtful. "My Harold, God rest him, used to say that marrying a beautiful woman was like buying a fancy horse. Looks pretty in the paddock, but if it can't pull a plow or survive a hard winter, what good is it? Out here, you need a partner who can weather storms, literal and otherwise. Someone who won't break the first time things get difficult." She reached across and patted Nora's hand. "Grant lost Catherine 5 years ago, and it near about destroyed him. That woman was his equal in every way, tough as nails, smart as a whip, kind as summer rain. He loved her something fierce. So when he finally decides he's ready to try again, do you really think he'd choose some simpering girl who'd cry the first time a cow died, or the well ran dry?" Nora felt her throat tighten. "You knew his wife. Everyone knew Catherine. She was special." Mrs. Patterson's eyes went distant with memory. "Came out here as a mail-order bride herself, actually, about 17 years ago. She was 23, already considered too old by most standards, and she'd been a nurse in St. Louis. Grant was just starting out then, barely had 2 nickels to rub together, but he took one look at her, and that was it." "What was she like?" "Practical, fearless. She could set a broken bone, birth a calf, and quote Shakespeare all in the same afternoon." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "And she didn't take any nonsense from anyone. When Grant proposed after knowing her 3 weeks, she told him he was crazy and she'd need at least 2 months to make sure he wasn't a fool. He waited, courted her proper, and she finally said yes. They had 10 good years together before the fever took her." The story settled over Nora like a blanket, warm and heavy. Grant Calloway wasn't just a successful rancher looking for a convenient wife. He was a widower who'd loved deeply and was willing to take his time finding someone worthy of his late wife's memory. And somehow, he thought Nora might be that person. What if I disappoint him? The words escaped before Nora could stop them. What if he realizes he made a mistake? Mrs. Patterson leveled her with a look that could have melted iron. Then that's his problem, not yours. But I don't think you will. You've got that same look Catherine had, like you've seen the worst life can throw at you and you're still standing. That's worth more than a pretty face out here, Miss Ellison. Don't you forget it. A knock at the front door made them both jump. Mrs. Patterson glanced at the clock on the mantel. 9 o'clock exactly. Man's punctual. I'll give him that. Nora's heart leaped into her throat. She stood, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. You look fine, Mrs. Patterson assured her. Now go on. I'll show him to the parlor. The parlor was a small room off the main hall, furnished simply with a horsehair sofa, 2 wooden chairs, and a bookshelf crammed with well-worn volumes. Sarah, Elizabeth, and the third woman, Caroline, were already there with their callers, sitting in careful groups while Mrs. Patterson's daughter Helen supervised from the corner, her knitting needles clicking steadily. Grant Calloway stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking impossibly large in the confined space. He'd cleaned up since yesterday. The dust was gone, his hair was combed back, and he wore a clean shirt and vest that looked like they'd been pressed within an inch of their lives. But he still carried that air of capability, of a man who was more comfortable with a horse than with parlor furniture. His eyes found Nora immediately, and something in his expression eased. Miss Ellison, good morning. Mr. Calloway? Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Good morning. I was hoping, he said, glancing at Mrs. Patterson, that you might take a walk with me. With proper supervision, of course. There's some things I'd like to show you, and the boarding house parlor's a bit crowded for conversation. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. Helen, go fetch your shawl. You'll chaperone Miss Ellison and Mr. Calloway on their walk. Helen, a sturdy girl of about 16, sighed but set aside her knitting. Yes, Mama. 5 minutes later, Nora found herself walking down Copper Creek's main street with Grant Calloway on one side and Helen Patterson trailing a respectful 10 paces behind. The morning sun was already warm, promising a hot afternoon, and the street was busy with Saturday traffic, wagons rumbling past, children darting between buildings, women with market baskets calling greetings to each other. Grant walked slowly, matching his long stride to Nora's shorter one. For a few moments, they walked in silence, and Nora felt the same nervous flutter she'd experienced yesterday. Up close in daylight, he seemed even more solid, a man carved from the same granite as the mountains in the distance. Sleep all right? He asked finally. Not particularly, Nora admitted. You? Not a wink. He smiled slightly. Kept thinking I'd dreamed the whole thing, and you'd be gone when I showed up this morning. The honesty of it made her chest ache. I'm still here. I can see that. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I appreciate you agreeing to walk with me. Wanted to talk without an audience. Well, he glanced back at Helen, mostly without an audience. What did you want to talk about? Everything. Grant gestured vaguely. Figure if we're considering marriage, we ought to know more about each other than just names and ages. So I thought we could ask questions, trading back and forth, honest answers only. That work for you? It was so practical, so direct, that Nora almost laughed. Yes, that works. Good. I'll start. He steered them around a mud puddle left from yesterday's brief rain. You said yesterday this was your 7th gathering. What made you keep trying after the first 6 didn't work out? Nora had expected curiosity about her past, but the question still stung. Stubbornness, mostly, and desperation, if I'm honest. I'm 31, Mr. Calloway. In Philadelphia, that makes me an old maid, a burden on my family, someone to be pitied. I thought if I could just find a husband, any husband, I'd have purpose again, a place where I belonged. And now? Now I'm not sure that was the right reason. She looked up at him. But I'm glad I tried one last time. He nodded slowly, processing this. Fair enough. Your turn to ask. Why did you really choose me? The question had been burning in her chest since yesterday. You said I reminded you of your wife, but then you said that wasn't why. So what was the real reason? Grant was quiet for so long that Nora thought he might not answer. They'd reached the edge of town now, where the buildings gave way to open prairie, and he stopped, staring out at the vast expanse of grassland rolling toward the mountains. When I rode up yesterday, he said finally, I saw all those women lined up, and most of them looked scared or excited or both. But you just looked tired, like you'd been fighting a battle for a long time, and you knew you were about to lose. And I thought, there's someone who understands what it costs to keep going when everything tells you to quit. He turned to face her, and his expression was serious. I've been where you were, Miss Ellison. After Catherine died, I wanted to quit. Thought about selling the ranch, moving east, starting over somewhere. I wouldn't see her ghost in every room. But I didn't, because quitting would have dishonored what we built together. So I kept going, day after day, even when it hurt like hell. His voice dropped lower. When I saw you standing there with that look on your face, I saw someone who knew that same kind of hurt. Someone who'd chosen to keep fighting even when it would have been easier to give up. And I thought, if this woman's got that much steel in her spine, she's someone I could build a life with. Someone who wouldn't run at the first sign of trouble. Nora's eyes burned with unexpected tears. No one had ever seen her that way. As strong rather than desperate, as resilient rather than pathetic. I'm not sure I'm as strong as you think. You're here, aren't you? Grant's smile was small but genuine. Takes strength to try 7 times. Most people quit after 2 or 3. They started walking again, following a dirt path that led away from town toward a small creek lined with cottonwood trees. Helen maintained her distance, occasionally stopping to examine wildflowers or kick at interesting rocks. My turn, Nora said. What exactly are you looking for in a wife besides grit and sense? Honesty. Grant said it immediately, like he'd been thinking about this for a while. Someone who'll tell me when I'm being a stubborn fool, which is often. Catherine never let me get away with anything. If I was wrong, she'd say so, and if I was right, she'd say that too. No games, no pretending, just straight talk. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm also looking for someone who wants to be part of something, not just married to it. The ranch isn't just my work. It was our work, Catherine's and mine. She had opinions about everything from which bulls to buy to how to manage the grazing rotation. Made us partners, not just husband and wife. That sounds wonderful, Nora said softly, and terrifying. I don't know anything about ranching. Didn't expect you to, but you know about teaching, about organization, about managing people and resources. That translates. He glanced at her. And you'd learn, if you wanted to. They'd reached the creek now, where the water burbled over smooth stones and the cottonwoods provided dappled shade. Grant gestured to a fallen log that made a natural bench, and they sat, Helen settling herself on a nearby rock to maintain her supervisory duties. Your turn, Grant prompted. Nora thought about what she most wanted to know. What would matter in the years to come if they actually went through with this? Do you want more children? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Catherine and I never had any. She couldn't. Something with her health. We made peace with it, though it hurt her something fierce. He was quiet for a moment. I'd welcome children if they came. But at 42, I'm practical enough to know they might not. Would that bother you? No. Nora surprised herself with how quickly the answer came. I've always loved children. Teaching was the best part of my life. But I've also accepted that marriage and motherhood might not be in my future. If it happens, I'd be grateful. If it doesn't, I'll find other ways to nurture. Teaching, Grant said, and something shifted in his tone. Interest, maybe even excitement. You said you were a teacher in Philadelphia. What did you teach? Everything, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, a little science. I taught at a charity school for children whose parents couldn't afford private tutors. Nora felt the familiar ache of loss. It closed 3 years ago when the funding ran out. I've missed it every day since. Grant leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. What if I told you there might be an opportunity to teach again? Nora's heart skipped. What do you mean? Blue Mesa's got about 15 families working the surrounding ranches and homesteads. Most of them have children, 30, maybe 35 kids total. Right now, the closest school is 20 miles away in Laramie, which means most of these kids don't get any education at all. Their parents can't spare them for the trip, and there's no money for boarding. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were bright with something that looked like hope. I've been thinking for years about building a schoolhouse on my property. Got a good spot picked out, near enough to the main house to be convenient, but far enough for privacy. Never had the time or the excuse to do it, but if I had a wife who was a teacher, well, that'd change things. Nora's mind spun. A school. Her own school, in a sense, teaching children who desperately needed it. The possibility was dizzying. You'd really do that? Been wanting to anyway. Catherine always said education was the difference between surviving and thriving out here. She taught some of the ranch hands to read at night, said it wasn't right that grown men couldn't sign their own names. His voice softened. She'd like you, I think. She'd like that you were a teacher. The weight of Catherine's ghost settled between them, not oppressive, but present. Nora chose her words carefully. I'm not trying to replace her. I know that. Grant's response was immediate. And I'm not asking you to. Catherine was Catherine and you're you, but that doesn't mean I can't see qualities in you that remind me why I fell in love with her. Strength, kindness, the ability to see what needs doing and do it without complaint. He reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering between them. Is it all right if I... Nora nodded, and he took her hand, his calluses rough against her palm. The touch sent a jolt through her, not romantic exactly, but something deeper. Connection. Recognition. I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Ellison, Grant said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I'm 42 years old, set in my ways, and probably more difficult to live with than I realize. I wake up before dawn every day, I track mud everywhere, and I've been told I'm too blunt for polite company. The ranch is 10 miles from town, so you'd be isolated most of the time. Winters are hard, sometimes we get snowed in for weeks, and there's always a chance of losing everything to drought or disease or a dozen other disasters. He squeezed her hand. But I'm also loyal to my bones. I don't lie, I don't cheat, and when I commit to something, I see it through. If you married me, I'd do everything in my power to make you happy. Not with fancy things or sweet words, but with respect and partnership and a life that matters. Nora's throat tightened. That's quite a speech, Mr. Calloway. Grant, he corrected. If we're courting, you should use my given name. Grant. She tested it, liking how it felt in her mouth. Then you should call me Nora. Nora. He said it like a promise. So what do you think? Am I everything you hoped for, or everything you feared? She laughed, surprising herself. Both, honestly. You're very intense. Been accused of that before, he smiled. Your turn for honesty. What are you afraid of? The question cut too close to the bone, but he'd been honest with her, and she owed him the same. I'm afraid this isn't real. That you'll wake up tomorrow and realize you made a mistake choosing someone like me. I'm afraid I'll disappoint you, or that I won't be strong enough for this life, or that... She broke off, embarrassed. Or that, Grant prompted gently. Or that I'll fall in love with you and you'll never love me back because I'm not Catherine. The words hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Nora wanted to take them back, to pretend she hadn't revealed something so desperately honest. But Grant didn't flinch. That's a fair fear. I can't promise I'll love you the same way I loved Catherine, but I can promise that if you give me a chance, I'll do my damnedest to build something new with you, something that's ours, not a shadow of what I had before. He stood, pulling her to her feet but not releasing her hand. Here's what I'm proposing, proper courtship. I'll come calling every day this week, show you the ranch, introduce you to my foreman and the hands, let you see the reality of what life would be. At the end of the week, if you still think we could make this work, I'll propose official-like. If not, I'll help you get to wherever you want to go next. No hard feelings. And if I say yes at the end of the week, then we get married and start building a life together. Grant's expression was serious. I won't lie to you, Nora. It'll be hard, but I think we could be happy. Different than what either of us expected, maybe, but happy nonetheless. Nora looked down at their joined hands, her pale piano teacher's hand in his sun-browned rancher's grip. It was the most honest proposal she'd ever received, dressed up in practicality, but undergirded with something real. All right, she said. Let's try. The smile that broke across Grant's face transformed him, making him look younger, almost boyish. Yeah? Yeah. He squeezed her hand once more, then released it with obvious reluctance. Then I better get you back before Mrs. Patterson thinks I've absconded with you. Tomorrow I'll take you out to the ranch, show you what you'd be getting into. That work? That works. They walked back toward town, Helen trailing behind them with a knowing smile. The morning had grown hot, the sun beating down mercilessly, but Nora barely noticed. Her mind was spinning with possibilities. A school, a partnership, a life that mattered. When they reached Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Grant stopped on the porch, turning to face her. Around them, Copper Creek bustled with Saturday business, and Nora could feel curious eyes tracking their every move. "Thank you for the walk," Grant said formally, though his eyes were warm. "I'll call for you tomorrow at 9, if that suits." "That suits." He hesitated, then reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I'm glad you came to that 7th gathering, Nora Ellison." "So am I." He tipped his hat and walked away, his long stride eating up the distance to where his horse was tied. Nora watched him go, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Well," Helen said from behind her, "that was interesting." Nora turned to find the girl grinning like she'd just witnessed something scandalous. "What?" "Mr. Calloway's been a widower for 5 years, and in all that time, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he just looked at you. Mama's going to be insufferably pleased with herself." Inside, Mrs. Patterson was indeed pleased, bustling about the kitchen with a satisfied smile. "Went well, did it?" "I think so." Nora sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "He's taking me to see the ranch tomorrow." "Good. Blue Mesa's beautiful. Catherine kept it nice, and I hear Grant's maintained it well. You'll like it there." Mrs. Patterson set a cup of tea in front of Nora. "You look done in, child. Why don't you rest this afternoon? There's a church social tonight if you're feeling up to it, but no pressure." Nora spent the afternoon in her room, alternately lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling and pacing the small space. Her mind wouldn't settle. She kept replaying the conversation by the creek, the feel of Grant's hand in hers, the way he'd said her name like it mattered. This was real. This was actually happening. After 6 failures, she'd finally found someone who saw her, really saw her, and wanted her anyway. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. That evening, she let Mrs. Patterson convince her to attend the church social. It was held in the church basement, a low-ceilinged room decorated with bunting and lit by oil lamps. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and someone had brought a fiddle, filling the space with lively music. The moment Nora walked in, she felt the stares. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Eyes tracked her movement. The whispers started immediately. She'd expected it, but it still stung. "Miss Ellison," Mrs. Caldwell swept toward her, resplendent in purple silk. "How lovely to see you. I trust Mr. Calloway's visit went well?" "Very well, thank you." "Excellent, excellent." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes gleamed with professional pride. "I must say, I'm quite pleased with how the gathering turned out. 7 successful matches so far, including yours." A woman Nora didn't recognize sidled closer, curiosity written all over her face. "Is it true Grant Calloway chose you over all those young girls?" "Yes." "Well." The woman looked her up and down, clearly trying to figure out what a successful rancher could possibly see in a 31-year-old spinster. "How unexpected." Nora felt her spine stiffen. She'd endured years of pity and judgment, and she was tired of it. "Not really. Mr. Calloway wanted a partner, not a decoration. I suppose that is unexpected for some people." Mrs. Caldwell laughed outright. "Well said, my dear. Come, let me introduce you to some of the other ladies. Ignore the gossips. They're just jealous." The evening passed in a blur of introductions and thinly veiled curiosity. Some women were genuinely kind, welcoming her warmly and expressing hope that her courtship would work out. Others were less subtle, their questions edged with skepticism or outright hostility. Through it all, Nora held her head high. She'd spent too many years feeling less than, feeling invisible. Grant Calloway had chosen her, and she'd be damned if she'd apologize for it. She was talking with a rancher's wife about the challenges of frontier teaching when a hush fell over the room. Nora turned to see Grant standing in the doorway, still in his work clothes, looking uncomfortable but determined. His eyes found hers immediately. "Miss Ellison, may I speak with you a moment?" The crowd parted as she crossed to him, whispers erupting in their wake. Outside, the evening air was blessedly cool after the stuffy basement. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Grant said, turning his hat in his hands. "I was heading home from town and saw the lights. Thought you might be here. Is something wrong?" "No, just—" He looked embarrassed. "I wanted to make sure you were all right. I know how people talk, and I didn't want you facing that alone." The gesture, so unexpected and thoughtful, made Nora's chest ache. "I'm fine. They're just curious." "They're gossiping," Grant corrected, "and I don't like it. You're under my protection now, even if we're not married yet. Anyone gives you trouble, you tell me." "Grant." She touched his arm lightly. "I've been dealing with gossip and judgment my whole life. I can handle it." "Don't mean you should have to." His jaw tightened. "I chose you publicly. That was deliberate. Wanted everyone to know I was serious, that you weren't some charity case or second choice, but I didn't think about how that would paint a target on your back. I appreciate the concern truly, but I'm tougher than I look." He studied her face in the lamplight spilling from the church windows. "I'm starting to see that." Then quietly, "This is real for me, Nora. I need you to know that. When I rode up to that platform yesterday, I wasn't looking for convenient or easy. I was looking for you, even if I didn't know it yet." Her breath caught. "Grant!" "Don't have to say anything, just wanted you to know." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll see you tomorrow at 9. Be ready to ride. We've got ground to cover." He was gone before she could respond, disappearing into the darkness beyond the church. Nora stood there for a long moment, her heart hammering, before returning to the social. The gossip was even worse after Grant's appearance, but somehow Nora found she didn't care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. She had something real, something worth fighting for, and their opinions didn't matter. That night, she slept better than she had in years. And when she woke Sunday morning to bright sunshine and the knowledge that Grant would be arriving in just hours, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Nora was waiting on the porch when Grant arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, leading a second horse alongside his own, a gentle-looking mare with a coat the color of honey and patient brown eyes. The sight of it made something catch in Nora's throat. He'd thought ahead, planned for her comfort, brought a horse that wouldn't spook or bolt with an inexperienced rider. "Morning," he said, swinging down from his saddle with that easy grace she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "This is Honey. She's the most even-tempered animal I've got, and she won't give you any trouble." "I should tell you," Nora said, coming down the steps, "I haven't ridden a horse in nearly 10 years. "That's all right. It comes back quick." He held Honey's reins while offering his other hand to help Nora mount. "Left foot in the stirrup, then swing your right leg over. I'll steady you." It was awkward and graceless, and Nora was acutely aware of showing more ankle than was strictly proper, but Grant kept his eyes averted and his grip firm until she was settled in the saddle. The world looked different from up here. Taller, wider, more exposed. "How's that feel?" Grant asked, adjusting her stirrups with quick, efficient movements. "Terrifying," Nora admitted. He smiled. "You'll be fine. Honey knows the way home better than I do. Just hold the reins loose and let her follow my horse. She'll do the rest." They rode out of Copper Creek heading west, the morning sun warm on Nora's back and the vast Wyoming landscape unfolding before them. Once they left the town behind, the silence was profound. No city noise, no crowds, just the creak of leather, the steady thud of hooves, and wind moving through the grass like breathing. "It's so quiet," Nora said after they'd been riding for 20 minutes. "Takes getting used to," Grant agreed. He rode easily, like the horse was an extension of himself, one hand loose on the reins while the other rested on his thigh. Catherine said the same thing when she first arrived. Came from St. Louis, where there was always noise, carriages, people, factories. Out here, the silence is louder than anything. "Tell me more about her," Nora said, then immediately worried she'd overstepped. "If you don't mind." Grant was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "She was fierce. That's the first word that comes to mind. Not mean, but fierce, like a wildfire, bright and warm and impossible to contain. When she made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. He guided his horse around a prairie dog hole, and Honey followed automatically. She came out here answering an ad I placed in a St. Louis paper. I was 25, drowning in work, needed help but couldn't afford to pay wages. Figured a wife made sense. Didn't expect to fall in love. But you did. Hard and fast. She stepped off that stagecoach looking like she'd been dragged through hell. 4 weeks of travel, dust everywhere, dress torn at the hem. But she took one look at me and said, "I hope you're better looking under all that dirt, because the ad didn't mention you'd be part mole." Grant's laugh was soft, remembering. I knew right then she was going to change my life. Nora listened, feeling the weight of Catherine's ghost between them. But it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was just there, like the mountains in the distance, solid and undeniable. She taught me to read poetry, Grant continued. Can you imagine? Cowboy like me, sitting by lamplight while she read Wordsworth and Byron. I thought it was foolish at first, but she said a man who only knows cattle is only half educated. So I learned. And you know what? She was right. Made me see the world different. She sounds wonderful. She was. He glanced at Nora. And I'm not telling you this to make you feel like you're competing with a memory. I'm telling you because if we do this, if we build a life together, Catherine's going to be part of it. Not between us, but beside us. And I need to know you can live with that. Nora considered this carefully. I think I can. My mother died when I was 12, and my father remarried 2 years later. My stepmother, Margaret's mother, never tried to replace her. She just made space for her memory while building something new with my father. I always respected that. Your father happy? Very. They had 20 good years together before he passed. Nora shifted in the saddle, her thighs already beginning to ache. I think there's room in a heart for more than one love. The loves just look different. Grant nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his features. That's what I'm hoping. They crested a rise, and suddenly the world opened up before them, a valley painted in shades of gold and green, with a creek cutting through like a silver ribbon. Buildings clustered near the water, a substantial 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, corrals where horses moved like living sculptures. Beyond it all, cattle dotted the hillsides, and the mountains rose in the distance, purple-blue and eternal. Blue Mesa, Grant said, and there was pride in his voice. Home. Nora's breath caught. It was beautiful. Not pretty in a delicate way, but beautiful like the land itself was beautiful, raw and real and honestly earned. You built all this? Catherine and me together. Started with just the cabin, that small building there by the creek. That first winter nearly killed us. But we survived, and the next year we built the barn, then started the house. Been adding to it ever since. He urged his horse forward. Come on, I want you to meet Jack. They rode down into the valley, and as they approached the barn, a man emerged, tall and lean, probably in his mid-50s, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that assessed everything with quiet intelligence. He watched them approach, then broke into a grin when he recognized Grant. Boss, wasn't expecting you back till this afternoon. Change of plans. Grant dismounted and helped Nora down, her legs wobbling slightly when her feet hit solid ground. Jack, this is Miss Nora Ellison from Philadelphia. Nora, this is Jack Brennan, my foreman, and the man who actually keeps this place running. Jack swept off his hat, revealing a mostly bald head. Ma'am, pleasure. Though I should correct the boss, he keeps this place running. I just make sure he doesn't work himself to death doing it. Don't believe him, Grant said. Jack's been with me 12 years, knows more about cattle and horses than any man in Wyoming. You're kind to say so. Jack's eyes flicked between them with open curiosity. We heard in town there was some excitement at the bride gathering, whole counties buzzing about it. Grant's jaw tightened slightly. People got too much time on their hands if they're gossiping about my business. Can't blame them. Been 5 years since Catherine passed, and everyone's been waiting to see if you'd find someone. Jack turned to Nora, his expression kind. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but this one's been married to his work too long. About time he remembered he's human. That's enough, Grant said, but there was no heat in it. Make yourself useful and show Miss Ellison around the barn while I check on the foal. Daisy dropped it Thursday night, and it was weak. Foal's fine, Jack assured him. Strong as anything now, but go look if it'll make you feel better. Miss Ellison and I will get acquainted. Grant hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and his need to check on his animals. Nora made the decision for him. Go, I'll be fine with Mr. Brennan. He nodded gratefully and disappeared into the barn. Jack watched him go, then turned back to Nora with a measuring look. So, Philadelphia schoolteacher comes west to marry a cowboy. That about the size of it? We're courting, Nora corrected. Not married yet. But you're considering it. I am. Jack gestured toward the barn. Walk with me, Miss Ellison. Let me show you what you'd be getting into. The barn was massive, well built, with stalls lining both sides and a hayloft overhead. The smell of horses and hay and leather was overwhelming at first, then oddly comforting. Jack led her down the center aisle, pointing out various animals and equipment. Grant runs about 200 head of cattle, he explained. Mostly Herefords, good beef cattle. We also keep 30 horses, working animals, not fancy. Spring and fall we're busy with calving and roundup. Summers for mending fences and moving herds to better grazing. Winters for survival. He stopped at a stall where a mare stood with a gangly foal pressed against her side. This is Daisy and her new boy, 4 days old and already causing trouble. Nora leaned on the stall door and chanted. The foal was all legs and curiosity, with a white blaze down his nose and eyes like polished stones. He's beautiful. He'll be a good cow pony when he grows up. Grant's got an eye for breeding. Jack's voice turned serious. Miss Ellison, I'm going to speak plain because that's the only way I know. Grant Calloway is the finest man I've ever worked for. Honest, fair, works harder than any hand on this ranch. But he's been alone too long, and loneliness makes a man brittle. Nora turned to look at him. What are you saying? I'm saying he needs someone, but he doesn't know how to need anyone anymore. After Catherine died, he closed up tight. Wouldn't talk about her, wouldn't let anyone mention her name. Just threw himself into work like he could outrun grief. Jack's expression was troubled. It's only been the last year or so he's seemed like himself again, like he might be ready to live instead of just exist. Are you warning me away? No, ma'am. I'm warning you in. This won't be easy. Grant's set in his ways, and he'll expect you to adapt to his life, might not think to adapt to yours. You'll need to stand your ground, same as Catherine did. She never let him steamroll her, and it made them equals. Nora absorbed this, grateful for the honesty. Thank you for telling me. Just want you to know what you're signing up for, Jack smiled. But if you can handle it, you'll have a good life here, and Grant will be a better man for having you. They found Grant in another stall, running his hands over the foal with practiced gentleness, while murmuring in a voice too low to make out words. When he noticed them watching, he straightened, looking almost embarrassed. Everything looks good. You were right, Jack. Usually am, Jack said mildly. I'll leave you two to your tour. Gotta check the south pasture fence before noon. He tipped his hat to Nora. Pleasure meeting you, Miss Ellison. Hope to see more of you. When he was gone, Grant led Nora out of the barn toward the house. It looked even more impressive up close. Solid construction, fresh paint, windows that actually fit their frames. The porch wrapped around two sides, complete with a swing that swayed gently in the breeze. Built this 4 years into our marriage, Grant said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. Catherine wanted room to grow, space for children if they came, space for guests, space to breathe. We never got the children, but the rest worked out. He hesitated, his hand on the porch railing. I should tell you, I haven't changed anything inside since she died. Her things are still there, her books, her sewing basket, even her apron hanging in the kitchen. I keep meaning to pack it away, but I don't, Nora said quickly. Don't pack it away on my account. If we marry, we'll figure out together what stays and what goes. But those are your memories, Grant. I won't ask you to erase them. The relief in his eyes was profound. You sure? I'm sure. He opened the door and Nora stepped into Catherine Calloway's home. The interior was spacious and clean, with large windows letting in floods of light. The front room served as parlor and dining area combined, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy table that could seat 8. The furniture was simple but well made, and everywhere Nora looked she saw evidence of Catherine, A quilt draped over the sofa in shades of blue and cream, books stacked on every available surface, a vase of dried wildflowers on the mantel. "Kitchen's through here," Grant said, leading her through a doorway. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the home. A massive cast-iron stove, counters worn smooth by use, open shelving displaying mismatched dishes. And there, hanging on a hook by the window, was an apron embroidered with small yellow flowers. Grant's hand went to it, his fingers brushing the fabric. "She was wearing this the day she got sick. I found it later, after—" He stopped, jaw working. Nora ached for him, for the grief still raw beneath the surface. She had good taste in flowers. Black-eyed Susans. Her favorites. Grant's voice was rough. She'd pick them by the armful every summer, put them in jars all over the house. Said they brought sunshine indoors. They stood there in silence, the ghost of Catherine Calloway present in the embroidered flowers, in the neat kitchen, and the love that still soaked into the walls. Finally, Grant cleared his throat and turned away from the apron. "Upstairs are 3 bedrooms. Master's at the front, 2 smaller rooms at the back. One's my office, the other's just storage now." He paused. "And out back, about 50 yards from the house, there's a spot I always thought would be perfect for a schoolhouse." Nora's heart jumped. "You were serious about that?" "I don't say things I don't mean." He walked to the kitchen window, gesturing for her to join him. "See that flat area near the cottonwoods? Good shade in summer, protected from wind in winter. Close enough for easy access, far enough for independence. Could build it 20 by 30 feet, fit 30 desks comfortable. Basic mathematics," she said, the ideas tumbling out. "History, geography, some practical science. Maybe music if anyone had an instrument. We'd need primers and slates, chalk, paper when we could afford it." "Already thought about supplies," Grant interrupted. "There's a catalog company in Chicago that sells to frontier schools. We could order what we need, take a few months to arrive, but we'd manage." She turned to face him, searching his expression for any sign that this was just talk, just promises he didn't intend to keep. But his eyes were serious, his posture open. "Why?" she asked. "Why offer this to someone you barely know?" "Because these children deserve a chance," Grant said simply. "And because watching you light up just now, talking about teaching, that's the most alive I've seen you look. If marrying me means you get to do what you love, then we both win." He moved closer, and Nora's breath caught. They were standing very near now, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, close enough to smell leather and horse, and something that was just him. "I want to be clear about something," Grant said quietly. "I'm not offering you a job or a project. I'm offering a partnership. The school would be yours to run however you see fit. But you'd also be my wife, sharing this house, this life, this work. Both things matter. Both things are real. What if I fail at one of them? Then we figure it out together." His hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her cheek. The calluses on his palm were rough against her skin, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Nora, I've been doing this alone for 5 years. I'm tired of alone. I want someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone to plan with, someone to build something with. I think you could be that person, but I need to know you want it too." "What?" Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I'm terrified." "Good, so am I." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone." The moment stretched between them, fragile and weighty. Then Grant stepped back, dropping his hand, and the spell broke. "I should show you the rest of the property," he said, his voice not quite steady. "And then I need to get you back to town before Mrs. Patterson sends out a search party." They spent the next 2 hours riding the boundaries of Blue Mesa, Grant pointing out landmarks and explaining the rhythms of ranch life. Nora absorbed it all: the spring where cattle gathered to drink, the line shack where hands stayed during roundup, the meadow where Catherine was buried beneath a simple stone marker. Grant dismounted there, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Nora. The grave was well tended, free of weeds, with fresh wildflowers scattered across the stone. The inscription read simply, "Catherine Ann Calloway, 1848 to 1878, beloved wife." "I come here most Sundays," Grant said, standing with his hat in his hands. "Talk to her sometimes, tell her about the week, ask her advice. Probably sounds foolish." "It doesn't." She'd like you, he said suddenly. You're different, quieter maybe, more careful with your words. But you've got that same steel underneath, that same refusal to quit when things get hard. He looked at Nora, his expression vulnerable. I need you to know that choosing you isn't about replacing her. It's about honoring what she taught me. That life's meant to be lived with someone, not alone. Nora moved to stand beside him, looking down at the grave. If we marry, I'd like to bring flowers here sometimes. Keep her memory tended, same as you do. Grant's hand found hers, squeezing tight. She'd really like you. They rode back to Copper Creek in companionable silence, arriving as the sun reached its zenith. The town was busy with Sunday afternoon activity, families returning from church, children playing in the street. Grant helped Nora dismount at Mrs. Patterson's, his hand steadying her waist. Tomorrow? He asked. Tomorrow, she confirmed. But instead of mounting his horse immediately, Grant glanced around at the people watching them. And there were people watching, faces in windows, and folks finding reasons to linger nearby, and made a decision. He took Nora's hand, raised it to his lips, and kissed it with deliberate care. The gesture was old-fashioned, courtly, and utterly public. Until tomorrow, Miss Ellison, he said clearly, his voice carrying. Then he mounted up and rode away, leaving Nora standing on the porch with her hand still tingling and the entire town staring. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, grinning like a cat with cream. Well, that certainly made a statement. He did that on purpose, Nora said faintly. Of course he did. Grant Calloway doesn't do anything by accident. Mrs. Patterson ushered her inside. Come on, you need lunch and then a rest. You look like you've been run over by a stampede. Over the next 3 days, a pattern emerged. Grant arrived every morning at 9, and they spent the day together, sometimes at the ranch, sometimes riding through the surrounding countryside, once visiting neighboring homesteads so Nora could meet the families whose children she might teach. Each evening he brought her back to town, and each evening he made some small public gesture of courtship, holding her hand as they walked, offering his arm when she stepped down from her horse, once bringing her a bouquet of black-eyed Susans that made Mrs. Patterson tear up. The town's opinion shifted gradually from scandalized skepticism to grudging acceptance. Grant's attentiveness was impossible to deny, and Nora's quiet dignity won over those inclined to be kind. The gossips still whispered, but their whispers had lost their sharp edges. On the 4th day, Grant took her to meet the Hendersons, a family homesteading 5 miles east of Blue Mesa. They had 6 children ranging from 4 to 15, and when Nora mentioned the possibility of a school, the mother nearly wept with gratitude. My oldest, Samuel, he's 15 and can barely write his name, Mrs. Henderson said, her work-worn hands twisting in her apron. I taught him what I could, but I only made it through 3rd year myself. The little ones, they're growing up wild, and it breaks my heart. Samuel, a gangly boy with his father's height and his mother's shy smile, hung back near the door. Nora turned to him directly. What would you most want to learn? If you could attend school? He blinked, startled at being addressed. Reading, I reckon. Pa's got a book about Lewis and Clark, and I'd give anything to know what's in it. Then we'll start there, Nora said. Reading opens every other door. Once you can read, you can teach yourself anything. The hope that lit the boy's face nearly broke her heart. They visited 4 more families that day, and the response was the same everywhere. Desperate gratitude, children hungry for knowledge, parents who'd given up hope their kids would ever have opportunities beyond endless work. By the time Grant took her back to Copper Creek, Nora's mind was spinning with possibilities. There are so many of them, she said as they rode through the twilight. At least 30 children, maybe more. And they need so much, not just basic skills, but hope, a reason to believe their lives can be different from their parents. You can give them that, Grant said. Can I? I'm one person, Grant. One teacher trying to educate children who've never sat in a classroom, using supplies we don't have yet, in a building that doesn't exist. Catherine used to say the same thing when she talked about teaching the hands to read. I'm one person. How can I possibly make a difference? He glanced at Nora. But she did make a difference. 3 of my men can read now because of her. They signed their own work contracts, wrote letters to families back east. One even started reading to his kids at night. That ripples out, Nora. One person teaching one person who teaches another. That's how change happens. She was quiet, absorbing this. Then, tell me about the first time Catherine taught someone to read. Grant smiled, remembering. Fellow named Tom, about 50 years old, been working cattle his whole life. Catherine cornered him one evening and asked if he'd like to learn. He was embarrassed, said he was too old, too stupid. She told him age had nothing to do with intelligence and offered to teach him 3 letters a week. Took 6 months, but by the end, Tom was reading the newspaper every Sunday, slow but steady. Where is he now? Died 2 years back, horse accident. Grant's voice turned soft. But at his funeral, his daughter thanked Catherine, said her father never stopped talking about how she'd given him a gift no one else thought he deserved. Made me realize that teaching isn't just about information. It's about dignity. They'd reached the edge of Copper Creek, where the last light was fading from the sky and lamps were being lit in windows. Grant pulled his horse to a stop, and Nora did the same. Tomorrow's Friday, he said. Our week of courtship ends. Nora's stomach flipped. Yes. I'm going to ask you something tomorrow evening, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. His eyes were serious in the gathering dark. Don't say yes because you're running out of options. Don't say yes because you think it's what you should do. Only say yes if you actually want this life. Want me, want the ranch, want all of it, hard parts included. And if I say no, then I'll take you wherever you want to go, pay for your passage, and wish you well. No hard feelings. He paused. But I'm hoping you'll say yes. Grant, don't answer now, he interrupted gently. Sleep on it. Pray on it if you're inclined. Tomorrow evening, I'll ask proper-like, and you'll give me your answer. That's how this works. He rode with her to Mrs. Patterson's, helped her down from Honey, and stood there holding both her hands in the darkness. Whatever you decide, he said quietly, these have been the best days I've had in 5 years. Thank you for giving me that. Then he was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving Nora standing alone with her heart in her throat and an impossible decision to make. Inside, Mrs. Patterson took one look at her face and poured 2 cups of strong coffee. They sat at the kitchen table and Nora told her everything. The ranch, the school, Grant's proposal that was coming tomorrow, her terror that she'd say yes and regret it, or say no and regret that even more. What does your heart tell you? Mrs. Patterson asked. That I want this more than I've ever wanted anything, and that terrifies me. As it should. Marriage isn't easy, especially frontier marriage. But Nora, Mrs. Patterson reached across the table, gripping her hand tight. You've spent your whole life playing it safe, and where did that get you? 6 rejections and a sister's spare room. Maybe it's time to be brave. That night, Nora barely slept. She lay in the darkness thinking about everything she'd seen over the past 4 days. Grant's weathered hands, gentle on a newborn foal, the way he spoke to his men with respect, Catherine's grave tended with such care, the children's faces lighting up at the mention of school. She thought about waking up each morning in that house with the wraparound porch, building a life alongside a man who saw her as a partner rather than a burden, teaching children who desperately needed what she could offer. And she thought about the alternative, returning east to Margaret's pity, or drifting from town to town looking for work, or trying an 8th bride gathering and facing rejection again, older now and more worn down. When dawn broke, she knew her answer. Friday dragged by with agonizing slowness. Grant didn't come for her in the morning, giving her space to think as he'd promised. Nora tried to occupy herself. She helped Mrs. Patterson with washing, attempted to read a novel someone had left in the parlor, wrote a letter to Margaret that she immediately tore up because she couldn't explain what she was feeling. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, there was a knock at the door. Grant stood on the porch wearing a suit, an actual suit, black and pressed, with a white shirt and string tie. He'd shaved, combed his hair back, and he looked so different from the dusty cowboy who'd thundered onto the platform 6 days ago that Nora almost didn't recognize him. Miss Ellison, he said formally, would you do me the honor of taking a walk? She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and let him offer his arm. They walked in silence through Copper Creek, past the church and the general store, and out toward the small creek where cottonwoods grew thick. The sun painted everything gold, and the evening air was soft and warm. Grant led her to a spot where someone, probably him, had spread a blanket beneath the largest tree, with a lantern waiting to be lit and a small basket sitting to one side. "I wanted somewhere private," he explained. "Hope that's all right. It's perfect." They sat, and for a long moment Grant just looked at her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "Nora Ellison," he began, and his voice was steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I've practiced this speech about 100 times, and I still don't know if I'll get it right. But here goes." He took both her hands in his. "6 days ago, I rode into town expecting to meet a pretty young thing who'd make my life easier. Instead, I found you, someone who'd been knocked down 6 times and still had the courage to stand up for a 7th. Someone who looked at my grief and didn't flinch. Someone who sees children others have given up on and wants to give them hope." His grip tightened. "I can't promise you easy. The ranch is hard work, the winters are brutal, and I'm set in my ways. I can't promise I'll always say the right thing or remember to be romantic. I can't promise you'll never feel lonely out there, 10 miles from town. And I sure as hell can't promise to love you the same way I loved Catherine, because every love is different. But," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "I can promise to respect you, to listen when you talk and value your opinions, to build that school and support your teaching, to work every day to make you glad you said yes, and to give you a life that matters, a partnership where you're valued for exactly who you are." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's ring. She gave it to me before she died, said to save it for someone special. Catherine wore her own mother's ring, so this one's been waiting." He held it up where it caught the fading sunlight. "Nora, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a stubborn cowboy and a life that won't be easy, but will be real?" The world seemed to hold its breath. Nora looked at the ring, at Grant's face, at the life being offered to her on this blanket under the cottonwoods. She thought about Catherine's ghost and 30 children needing a teacher and a house with a wraparound porch waiting to become a home. She thought about fear and courage and the difference between them. And she thought about standing on platform after platform, invisible and unwanted, until a man with storm-gray eyes had seen her and chosen her anyway. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Grant's face was like sunrise. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. And then with careful deliberation, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and charged with promise. And when he pulled back, Nora's eyes were wet with tears she hadn't known she was crying. "Thank you," Grant whispered. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for asking." They sat there as the sun set completely and stars began to appear overhead, talking about everything and nothing. When they'd marry, 3 days, Grant said he'd waited long enough. Where they'd honeymoon, nowhere. The ranch needed him, but maybe a trip to Denver next spring. How they'd build the school, start as soon as the weather held. What their life would look like. And for the first time in 6 years, Nora Ellison felt like she'd finally come home. 3 days turned out to be wildly optimistic. Between arranging for a minister, preparing the necessary documents, and dealing with the sheer logistics of a frontier wedding, it took a full week before Nora Ellison stood in the small Copper Creek church wearing a dress she'd never imagined owning. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on making it, pale cream silk that must have cost a fortune, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. When Nora protested the expense, the older woman waved her off with tears in her eyes. "Catherine was my friend," she said simply. "She'd want this done right, and Grant Calloway deserves to see his bride look beautiful, even if he's too practical to say so." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect October day that made you believe in Providence. Nora stood in Mrs. Patterson's spare room, staring at her reflection in the small mirror while her hands shook so badly she couldn't manage the buttons running down her back. "Here, let me." Helen appeared behind her, fingers deftly working the tiny pearl buttons. "You're nervous." "Terrified," Nora admitted. "What if I'm making a terrible mistake? What if he realizes I'm not what he wants? What if you spend your whole life asking what if and miss out on something wonderful?" Helen finished the last button and turned Nora around to face her. "Miss Ellison." "Nora." I've lived in this town my whole life. I've seen a lot of marriages, good and bad, and I've never seen a man look at a woman the way Mr. Calloway looks at you, like you're water in the desert. He loved Catherine so much. He did. And maybe he'll love you differently, but that doesn't mean less. Helen squeezed her shoulders. Now stop worrying and go marry that man before he wears a hole in the church floor from pacing. The church was small and simple, with rough-hewn pews and windows that let in floods of morning light. Nora had expected a quiet ceremony. Just her and Grant, Mrs. Patterson and Jack Brennan as witnesses, maybe the minister's wife. Instead, when she walked through the doors on Mrs. Patterson's arm, she found the church packed. Ranchers and their families filled every pew. Women she'd met only once smiled at her with genuine warmth. Children craned their necks to see, whispering excitedly. And standing at the front, looking like he might actually be sick with nerves, was Grant Calloway in that same black suit, his gray eyes locked on her with an intensity that stole her breath. Jack Brennan stood beside him as best man, grinning broadly. The minister, Reverend Walsh, waited with his Bible open. And there in the front pew, Mrs. Patterson had saved a seat, an empty space with a bouquet of black-eyed Susans laid across it, for Catherine, so she could be present in her way for this new beginning. The gesture made Nora's throat tight, and she saw Grant notice it too, saw something vulnerable and grateful cross his face. Mrs. Patterson walked her down the short aisle, and when they reached the front, she placed Nora's hand in Grant's with a whispered, "Be happy, both of you." Reverend Walsh cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Grant Thomas Calloway and Nora Margaret Ellison in holy matrimony." Nora barely heard the rest. She was too focused on Grant's hand holding hers, warm and solid and real. On the way, he was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. On the absolute certainty settling into her bones that this was right, that every rejection and disappointment had led her exactly here, to this moment, to this man. "Grant," Reverend Walsh was saying, "do you take Nora to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do." Grant's voice was steady, sure, and his hand squeezed hers. "And Nora, do you take Grant to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" She looked up at him, at this man who'd chosen her when no one else would, who saw strength where others saw desperation, who was offering her not just marriage, but partnership and purpose, and a life that mattered. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you man and wife." Reverend Walsh smiled. "Grant, you may kiss your bride." Grant's hands came up to frame her face, gentle and reverent, and he kissed her in front of everyone. Not the chaste peck Nora expected, but a real kiss, one that made her toes curl in her borrowed shoes and drew a collective sigh from the watching crowd. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. "Hello, Mrs. Calloway." The name sent a shiver through her. Mrs. Calloway. She was married. After 31 years of being invisible and unwanted, she was someone's wife. The church erupted in applause and cheers. People surged forward to offer congratulations, and suddenly Nora was being hugged by women she barely knew and having her hand pumped by ranchers with calloused palms. Grant stayed close, his hand at the small of her back, anchoring her through the chaos. Mrs. Henderson, the homesteader with 6 children, gripped both of Nora's hands with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saying yes. Those children, my children, they're going to have a chance now because of you." The weight of that gratitude, of those expectations, should have been crushing. Instead, it felt like purpose settling onto Nora's shoulders, solid and right. Outside the church, someone had organized an impromptu celebration. Tables appeared laden with food, roasted chicken, fresh bread, pies of every variety, even a small wedding cake that Mrs. Patterson swore she hadn't made, though everyone knew she had. Someone produced a fiddle, and music filled the air. Grant kept Nora's hand in his through all of it, introducing her to people she'd missed meeting during their week of courtship. There was Tom's daughter, who thanked Nora through tears for marrying a man who valued education the way Catherine had. There was a young couple, homesteaders barely older than Nora, who shyly asked if their 3 children could attend the school. There was an older rancher named Pete who'd known Grant since he first arrived in Wyoming and declared that Catherine would approve of his choice. She always said, Pete told Nora, his weathered face serious, that Grant needed someone with backbone, someone who wouldn't let him disappear into work and grief. "You look like you got backbone, Mrs. Calloway." "I'm trying," Nora said honestly. "That's all anyone can do." As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued, Grant leaned close to Nora's ear. "Ready to go home?" Home. The word resonated through her chest. Yes. They said their goodbyes, accepted final congratulations and well wishes, and climbed into the wagon Grant had brought. Not his usual work wagon, but one that had been cleaned and decorated with ribbon and wildflowers, courtesy of some well-meaning neighbors. Their bags were already loaded in the back, everything Nora owned in the world contained in 2 valises and a trunk. The ride to Blue Mesa took nearly 2 hours, and they spent it mostly in comfortable silence, Grant's arm around Nora's shoulders as the wagon rolled through the vast Wyoming landscape. The October afternoon was perfect. Warm sun, cool breeze, the smell of sage and earth and distance. "You're quiet," Grant said finally. "Having second thoughts?" "No, just thinking." Nora leaned into his solid warmth. "This morning I was Nora Ellison, spinster school teacher. Now I'm Mrs. Grant Calloway, rancher's wife. It's a lot to process." "You're still you, just with a different last name and a husband who's probably going to drive you crazy." She smiled. "Probably." Catherine used to say I was impossible to live with the first year, too set in my ways, too used to doing everything myself. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll try not to be that way with you, but I'll probably fail sometimes. When I do, tell me. Don't just suffer through it." "That goes both ways," Nora said. "I've lived alone or with family for 31 years. I have my own annoying habits." "Like what?" "I read late into the night and need lamplight. I talk to myself when I'm working through a problem. I'm particular about how books are organized and get irritable when I'm hungry." Grant laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "That's it? That's your list of faults? There are more. You'll discover them." "Looking forward to it." They crested the rise and Blue Mesa spread out before them. Home now, not just Grant's ranch, but theirs together. The house looked golden in the afternoon light, welcoming, and Nora felt something settle deep in her chest. This was real. This was happening. Jack Brennan met them at the barn, grinning like a fool. "Congratulations, boss, Mrs. Calloway." He tipped his hat to Nora. "We'll handle the horses. You two get yourselves settled." Grant helped Nora down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms. She let out an undignified squeak. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold. It's tradition." He was already walking toward the house, her weight apparently nothing to him. "Catherine would haunt me if I skipped it." He carried her up the porch steps and through the front door, only setting her down once they were inside. The house was exactly as she remembered, spacious and clean, with Catherine's touches everywhere. But there were differences, too. Fresh flowers in the vase on the mantel, the table set for 2, lamps already lit against the coming evening. "Jack and some of the men's wives helped get things ready," Grant explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "Wanted it to be welcoming for you. If there's anything you want to change..." "It's perfect," Nora said honestly. "Thank you." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, the reality of what came next settling between them. They were married now. This was their wedding night. And while they'd been courting for a week, they barely knew each other in the ways that mattered for what was expected. Grant seemed to read her thoughts. "Nora, there's no pressure tonight, or any night for that matter. We can take this as slow as you need." The relief was immediate and profound. "Thank you. I want..." She stopped, frustrated with her inability to articulate what she was feeling. "How about we start with dinner?" Grant suggested gently. "Mrs. Patterson sent food and I'm starving. We can eat, talk, figure things out from there. No expectations beyond that." They ate at the kitchen table, the food delicious, but Nora barely tasting it. She was too aware of Grant sitting across from her, of the ring on her finger catching lamplight, of the strangeness and rightness of being here in this house as his wife. Tell me about your first days here, she said, needing to fill the silence. When you first came to Wyoming, Grant leaned back in his chair, considering. I was 23, stupid with confidence, and had $300 to my name. Bought land cheap because nobody else wanted it. Too far from town, water situation uncertain, soil looked poor. Spent my first winter in a lean-to that barely kept out the snow, eating salt pork and hardtack, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. What kept you going? Stubbornness, mostly, and the land itself. It got under my skin. Every morning I'd wake up and see those mountains, that endless sky, and I'd think, this is mine. I can build something here that lasts. He smiled. Catherine thought I was crazy when she first arrived. We'd been married 2 days, and she took one look at the cabin and said, "Please tell me this is temporary." I promised her a real house, and it only took 5 years to deliver. But she stayed. She stayed, even when it was hard, even when we lost cattle to disease or went weeks without seeing another soul. She stayed because she believed in what we were building. His eyes met Nora's. I'm hoping you'll feel the same way. I already do, Nora said quietly. This afternoon, when Mrs. Henderson thanked me for giving her children a chance, that's when I knew this was right. I have purpose here, Grant. Real purpose. Not just filling time until I die. Something shifted in his expression, something warm and grateful. Come here. She stood, and he pulled her onto his lap, his arms coming around her waist. It should have felt awkward or presumptuous, but instead it felt natural, like coming home. We're going to be all right, Grant murmured against her hair. You and me. It might take some figuring out, but we'll get there. Nora turned in his arms to face him. I'm not Catherine. I know that. And I need you to know that I'm not trying to be her. I'll make mistakes she never would have made. I'll do things differently, and sometimes that might be hard for you. Grant's hand came up to cup her cheek. Catherine was Catherine, and you're you. I married you, Nora, not her ghost. You. He kissed her forehead, gentle and reassuring. Now come on, let me show you where everything is in this house, since you're the lady of it now. He gave her a tour, pointing out where supplies were kept, showing her the root cellar and the smokehouse, explaining the rhythms of the household. The master bedroom was on the second floor facing east, with a large bed covered in a quilt Catherine had made, and a wardrobe that Grant opened to reveal empty space. I cleared it out last week, he said. Packed Catherine's things into a trunk in the attic. Figured you'd want your own space. But if you want to see any of it or keep anything, you just say so. The gesture, the care he'd taken to make room for her, literally and figuratively, made Nora's eyes burn. Thank you. That means more than you know. That night they lay together in the big bed, Grant keeping a respectful distance, though his hand found hers in the darkness, and held on. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the valley, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods. Inside, Nora stared at the ceiling and thought about how her life had changed in just 10 days. 10 days ago, she'd been ready to give up entirely. Now she was married to a good man, living on a beautiful ranch with a school to build and children to teach. It felt like a dream, except dreams didn't come with calloused hands holding yours or the solid warmth of another person breathing beside you. You still awake? Grant's voice came quiet through the dark. Yes? Just wanted to say, I'm glad you're here, in case I forget to mention it tomorrow or the day after, when I'm knee-deep in work and forgetting to be romantic. He squeezed her hand. You being here makes this house feel like a home again. Nora rolled onto her side to face him, though she could barely see him in the darkness. Grant? Yeah? Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for saying yes. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped between them. And when Nora woke to dawn light streaming through the windows, her first thought was of contentment. She was home. The next weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Nora learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early rising before dawn, the constant cycle of work, the way weather dictated everything. She learned to cook on the massive stove, to preserve food for winter, to manage the household accounts that Grant handed over with obvious relief. Catherine handled all this, he admitted, showing her the ledger where every expense and income was carefully noted. I can wrangle cattle and fix fences, but keeping track of money makes my head hurt. Then I'll handle it, Nora said, already seeing ways to organize things more efficiently. You focus on the ranch. I'll focus on this. She also started planning the school in earnest. Grant took her to the building site, and they spent hours measuring and discussing. How big should the windows be? Where should the door face? Should they include a small room in the back for storage, or would that be wasteful? Make it however you want, Grant said. This is your domain. Jack Brennan and two of the hands began construction in early November, working between their other duties. Nora visited the site daily, watching the schoolhouse take shape, rough timber walls rising, windows being fitted, a door hung on leather hinges. It was simple and practical, but it was hers. She spent evenings writing to the Chicago Catalog Company, ordering primers and slates and chalk. She wrote to Margaret, too, finally, explaining everything that had happened. Her sister's response came 6 weeks later, full of shock and worry, and, buried beneath both, relief that Nora had finally found her place. The first real test of their marriage came in late November, when winter arrived with a vengeance. A blizzard rolled in overnight, dumping 3 feet of snow and bringing temperatures so low that water froze solid in the kitchen pump. Grant had to break ice in the trough twice daily so the cattle could drink, and he came in each evening exhausted and half frozen. Nora learned to heat bricks by the fire to warm the bed, to make thick stews that would stick to Grant's ribs, to not take it personally when he was too tired to talk and just collapsed into bed. She learned that ranch work didn't stop for weather, that animals needed tending no matter how brutal the conditions. She also learned that she was tougher than she'd thought. When Grant came down with a fever from pushing himself too hard in the cold, Nora took over managing the household and coordinating with Jack to ensure the work got done. She nursed Grant through 3 days of chills and delirium, forcing broth down his throat and keeping cold compresses on his forehead. And when he finally woke clear-headed, the first thing he said was, "You didn't have to do all that." "Yes, I did," Nora replied firmly. "You're my husband. This is what partners do." Something in his eyes shifted, deepened. Catherine would have said the same thing. Then she and I agree on something. By December, the school was finished. A simple one-room building with 6 windows, a wood stove in the corner, and space for 30 students. Grant built the desks himself, working in the barn during evenings, refusing Nora's offer of help. "You're giving these children education," he said. "Least I can do is give them somewhere to sit." The desks were simple but sturdy, each one sanded smooth so there were no splinters to catch small hands. When Nora ran her fingers over the wood, she could feel the care Grant had put into each piece. "They're perfect," she whispered. Christmas came, and with it a surprise. Grant had invited neighboring families to the ranch for a celebration, and the house filled with people and noise and children. Nora had worried about hosting her first party as Mrs. Calloway, but the women were kind and the men respectful, and by the end of the evening she felt like maybe, possibly, she was starting to belong. Mrs. Henderson pulled her aside before leaving. "School starts after the new year?" "First week of January," Nora confirmed, "if the weather holds. My children are so excited they can barely sleep. Samuel's been practicing his letters every night." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "You've given us hope, Mrs. Calloway. Real hope that our children's lives can be different than ours." After everyone left and they were cleaning up, Grant found Nora standing at the window staring out at the moonlit snow. "You all right?" "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if I can't do this? What if I'm not a good enough teacher? What if—" He turned her around, hands on her shoulders. "Nora, you taught school in Philadelphia for how many years?" 8. "And you were good at it?" "I think so. The students seemed to learn." "Then you'll be good at this too. The only difference is these children are desperate for what you're offering. They want to learn. That makes your job easier, not harder." He pulled her close, and she let herself lean into his solid warmth. Besides, Catherine always said the best teachers are the ones who care more about their students than about being perfect. You care. That's what matters. New Year's came and went, and on the first Monday of January, Nora walked to the schoolhouse at dawn to prepare for her first day. The building was cold, so she started a fire in the stove and arranged the desks in neat rows. She'd received the shipment from Chicago just before Christmas: primers, slates, chalk, even a large map of the United States that now hung on the front wall. At 8 o'clock, children began arriving with their parents. Some came on foot, others in wagons, a few on horseback. Nora stood at the door greeting each family, learning names, assigning seats. Samuel Henderson arrived with his 5 siblings, the oldest boy looking nervous and hopeful in equal measure. The youngest was only 4, probably too young for formal schooling, but Mrs. Henderson whispered, "She'll be quiet, I promise. I can't leave her home alone." "She's welcome," Nora assured her. "We'll find ways to keep her occupied." By 8:30, she had 28 students crammed into the schoolhouse, ranging in age from 4 to 17. They were a motley group, some in clothes that were little more than rags, others reasonably well dressed, all of them staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and hope that made her chest tight. Nora stood at the front of the room, looking at those faces, and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. These children were counting on her. Their parents were counting on her. Grant was counting on her. "Good morning," she said, and her voice came out steady. "My name is Mrs. Calloway, and I'm going to be your teacher. Some of you can already read and write. Some of you can't. That doesn't matter. We're all starting together today, and we're all going to learn together." She picked up a piece of chalk. "Let's begin." The first day was chaos. The children's skill levels varied wildly. Samuel could barely write his name, while a 12-year-old girl named Emma read at what would have been a 6th grade level in Philadelphia. Keeping everyone engaged and learning was like trying to herd cats, and by the time 3 o'clock arrived and parents came to collect their children, Nora was exhausted. But she was also exhilarated. Because despite the chaos, learning had happened. Samuel had successfully written 3 letters. The youngest children had practiced counting. Emma had helped teach a group of middle students to sound out words. It was messy and imperfect, but it was real. Grant met her halfway back to the house, taking one look at her face and smiling. "That good or that bad?" "Both," Nora said, and found herself laughing. "It was the hardest thing I've done in years, and I can't wait to do it again tomorrow." He kissed her, right there in the middle of the ranch yard with the hands probably watching, and whispered against her lips, "Knew you could do it." The winter passed in a rhythm of teaching and learning and building a life with Grant. Some days were hard, days when the cold was brutal, or a student struggled, or Nora and Grant snapped at each other from exhaustion. But more days were good, filled with small victories and quiet contentment. They learned each other slowly, carefully. Nora discovered that Grant was grumpy in the mornings until he'd had coffee, that he read poetry late at night when he thought she was asleep, that he had nightmares sometimes about losing Catherine and would wake up gasping. Grant learned that Nora needed solitude to recharge after days with the children, that she had a wicked sense of humor that surprised him, that she was braver than she believed herself to be. They learned to be married, to negotiate sharing space and lives and futures. It wasn't always smooth, but it was real, and real was what they'd both been searching for. On a cold February evening, Nora found Grant standing at Catherine's grave, snow falling soft around him. She'd learned he did this sometimes, visited, talked, sought counsel from memory. Usually she gave him privacy, but tonight something made her walk out to stand beside him. "She'd be proud of you," Grant said quietly, not seeming surprised by her presence. "The school, the children, it's exactly what she dreamed of. I wish I could have known her. She'd have liked you. You're different in a lot of ways, but the same in the ways that matter. Strong, kind. Stubborn as hell when you believe in something." Nora looked down at the snow-covered grave. "Do you still love her?" "Yes, but I'm also falling in love with you." Grant turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable. "They're not competing loves, Nora. They're just different. What I had with Catherine was built over 10 years of partnership and shared struggle. What we have is still being built, but it's no less real." He took her cold hands in his. "I know I haven't said it yet. The words. I wanted to wait until I was sure, until I wasn't just saying them because it seemed like the right time. But Nora, I love you. Not the same way I loved Catherine, but just as deeply. Maybe deeper, because I know now how precious it is to find someone you can build a life with." Tears froze on Nora's cheeks. "I love you too. I think I started falling for you that first day when you chose me in front of everyone." They kissed in the falling snow beside Catherine's grave, and it felt like benediction. Like the past and present and future were all aligned, all blessing this moment. Spring came eventually, bringing warmth and new life to Blue Mesa. The school flourished, and Nora's students blossomed under her care. Samuel was reading simple books now, his face lighting up every time he conquered a new word. Emma had progressed so far that Nora was teaching her algebra in the afternoons. Even the youngest children could recognize letters and count to 100. Parents came by regularly to thank her, often in tears. The Henderson family brought her a quilt they'd made. Another family, the Martins, carved her name into a wooden sign for the schoolhouse. The gratitude was overwhelming and humbling. In May, Nora woke one morning feeling ill. She tried to push through it, but by noon she was vomiting into a bucket while Grant held her hair back and looked worried. "Should I fetch the doctor from Copper Creek?" "No," Nora said weakly. Grant, I think I might be pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. They'd been married 6 months now, sharing a bed for 4 of them, but they'd both avoided talking about the possibility of children. After Catherine's inability to conceive, Nora hadn't wanted to get Grant's hopes up. "Are you sure?" His voice was carefully neutral. "No, but the symptoms match what I've heard." She looked up at him, trying to read his expression. "How do you feel about that?" Grant sat back on his heels, and a slow smile spread across his face. Terrified, excited, grateful. He pulled her into his arms, careful of her nausea. A baby. Our baby. Catherine would be so happy. The doctor confirmed it 3 weeks later. Nora was pregnant, due in late December. The news spread through the community like wildfire, and suddenly she couldn't go anywhere without someone offering advice or congratulations. She continued teaching through the spring and into summer, though Grant worried constantly about her overdoing it. When she finally agreed to take a break in late July, her students gave her a card they'd all signed, with drawings and misspelled well wishes that made her cry. "We'll be here when you're ready to come back," Samuel said solemnly. "Me and Emma, we can help teach the little ones if you need us to." "I'll take you up on that," Nora promised. The baby, a girl they named Catherine Rose, arrived on Christmas Eve in the midst of another blizzard. The doctor couldn't make it from town, so Jack Brennan's wife Sarah, who'd helped birth half the children in the county, delivered the baby while Grant paced the kitchen below and wore a groove in the floorboards. When Sarah finally called him up and placed the tiny, squalling bundle in his arms, Grant wept openly. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Nora, she's perfect." Nora, exhausted and elated, reached for both of them. "She's ours." They'd been married a year, 1 year since Grant had ridden late to the platform and chosen her. 1 year since Nora had said yes to a life she'd never imagined. And now here they were, husband and wife, partners, parents, building something real and lasting in the Wyoming wilderness. That night, with baby Catherine sleeping in the cradle Grant had built and snow falling soft outside the windows, Nora thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, desperate, invisible, ready to give up. And she thought about the woman she was now, loved, purposeful, exactly where she belonged. "What are you thinking about?" Grant asked softly from his chair by the fire, where he'd been staring at their daughter like she might disappear if he looked away. "How strange life is. How one choice, one moment, can change everything." "You mean me showing up late to that gathering?" "I mean you seeing me when no one else did, choosing me when you could have had anyone." She smiled at him across the room. "Best decision I ever made was being brave enough to say yes." Grant came to sit on the edge of the bed, taking her hand. "Best decision I ever made was being late that day. Gave me time to see past the pretty faces to the one woman worth choosing." Outside, the blizzard howled and Wyoming stretched vast and unforgiving in all directions. But inside the house at Blue Mesa Ranch, there was warmth and love and family. There was a cradle with a sleeping baby, a man and woman who'd found each other against all odds, and a future spreading out before them bright with possibility. Nora Calloway closed her eyes, Grant's hand warm in hers, and knew with absolute certainty that she was finally, truly home. Spring arrived with a tenderness that felt personal, as if the Wyoming wilderness itself was celebrating the new life at Blue Mesa Ranch. Catherine Rose was 4 months old now, a chubby-cheeked miracle who had her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's serious expression. She slept in the cradle beside their bed, and Grant still couldn't pass by without stopping to stare at her, his face soft with wonder that never seemed to fade. Nora had returned to teaching in March, bringing Catherine with her to the schoolhouse. The baby spent her days sleeping in a basket near the stove or being passed around by adoring students during breaks. The older girls especially loved her, treating her like a living doll, and Nora found that having an infant in the classroom actually helped. It taught responsibility and gentleness, and gave the students a practical lesson in caring for something fragile. Samuel Henderson, now 16 and reading at what would have been an 8th grade level back east, had become Nora's unofficial assistant. He helped the younger children with their letters while she worked with the middle group on arithmetic, and his patience with the smallest ones was remarkable. More than once, Nora had caught him reading to Catherine, his voice soft and careful as he sounded out words from the primer. "You're good with her," Nora told him one afternoon after the other students had left. Samuel blushed, ducking his head. "She's easy, just lies there listening, doesn't judge if I stumble over words." "You hardly stumble anymore. You've come so far this year. Because you believed I could learn." He looked at her with an intensity that reminded her why she'd chosen this life. "Ma says I'm the first Henderson in 3 generations who can read. Says it changes things, knowing I won't have to make my mark with an X on documents like Pa does. It does change things. And Samuel," Nora chose her words carefully, "you're smart enough to do more than ranch work if you want. There are schools back east, normal schools that train teachers. If you were interested, you think I could be a teacher?" The hope in his voice was painful to hear. "I think you already are one. I've watched you with the younger students. You have a gift for it." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the baby sleeping peacefully in her basket. "Would cost money, though. Money we don't have. Let me talk to Grant. There might be ways to manage it." She smiled at his shocked expression. "You're too talented to waste, Samuel. Give me time to work on it." That evening, she brought it up with Grant while they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Catherine dozed against his chest, her tiny fist clutching his shirt, and Nora thought not for the first time how fatherhood had transformed him. He was still the same practical, hardworking rancher, but there was a softness now that hadn't been there before. "Samuel Henderson wants to be a teacher," she said without preamble. Grant didn't seem surprised. "He's good with the kids. I've seen him helping out when I stop by the schoolhouse. He's more than good. He's gifted. But his family can't afford to send him to normal school, and without training, he'll never get hired anywhere." She paused. "I was thinking we could sponsor him, pay for his schooling back east, maybe in St. Louis or Chicago. He could come back and teach here, or in Copper Creek, or wherever he's needed." Grant was quiet, his hand rubbing slow circles on Catherine's back. Nora had learned to recognize this particular silence. He was thinking, weighing options, considering implications. "How much would it cost?" he asked finally. "Maybe $500 for 2 years, including room and board. It's not nothing, but the ranch has been profitable. And—" "Do it." Nora blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Grant looked at her, his expression serious. "Catherine always said education was the best investment we could make. She'd approve of this. Hell, she'd probably insist on it." He shifted the baby higher on his chest. "Besides, if we can give that boy a future, why wouldn't we? We've been blessed, Nora. Might as well share it." The generosity of it, the simple goodness, made Nora's throat tight. "I love you." "I love you too. Now go tell Samuel before I change my mind." But his smile belied the words. Samuel's reaction when she told him the next day was everything Nora could have hoped for. The boy, no, the young man, stood speechless for a full minute before his face crumpled and he started crying. Great heaving sobs that he tried to hide, turning away and wiping furiously at his eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I never thought, we can't possibly accept—" "You can and you will," Nora said firmly. "Grant and I discussed it. We want to do this, Samuel. You have too much potential to waste." "But what if I fail? What if I can't do the work back east and you've wasted all that money?" "You won't fail. And even if you struggled, which you won't, it wouldn't be wasted. Knowledge is never wasted." She gripped his shoulders. "Samuel, when I was your age, I was desperate to go to normal school, but my family couldn't afford it. A teacher at my school paid my way, said I had promise, and she wanted to invest in it. That gift changed my entire life. Let us give you the same chance." He nodded, still crying, and Nora pulled him into a hug that probably broke every rule of teacher-student propriety but felt necessary anyway. When he finally pulled back, his face was blotchy and wet but determined. "I'll make you proud, Mrs. Calloway. I swear it." "You already have." "You?" The news spread through the community, and the reaction was mixed. Some families were thrilled, seeing it as proof that education could open doors their children had never dreamed of. Others were skeptical or even resentful, muttering that the Calloways were putting on airs, trying to make Samuel think he was better than his raising. Mrs. Henderson showed up at the ranch 2 days later, wringing her hands and looking distressed. Grant was out checking the north pasture, so Nora received her in the kitchen, pouring coffee and waiting for the woman to gather her thoughts. "Mrs. Calloway, I don't know how to say this properly," Mrs. Henderson began, her voice shaking. "What you and your husband are doing for Samuel, it's too much. We can't accept charity like that." "It's not charity," Nora said gently. "It's an investment in a brilliant young man who happens to be your son." "But $500, that's more than my husband makes in 2 years. How could we ever repay you?" "We don't want repayment. We want Samuel to have the education he deserves." Nora reached across the table to grip the woman's hand. "Mrs. Henderson, when I met you that first time, you said you wanted your children to have chances you never had. This is that chance. Don't let pride take it away from Samuel." Mrs. Henderson was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered face. "He reads to us every night now, all 6 of us, sitting around the table while Samuel reads from whatever book you've lent him. My husband, he acts like it's foolishness, but I see him listening. I see him proud of his boy, even if he can't say it. Then let us do this. Please." Finally, Mrs. Henderson nodded. "All right, but someday, when we can, we'll find a way to pass this kindness forward, to help some other child the way you're helping ours. That's all we ask." Samuel left for St. Louis in August, carrying a trunk full of clothes that half the community had donated and enough money to see him through 2 years of normal school. The whole Henderson family came to see him off, along with what felt like every family in the county. Grant had driven him to Copper Creek to catch the eastbound stage, and Nora stood on the platform with Catherine in her arms, watching Samuel try not to cry. "Write to us," she told him. "Tell us everything you're learning." "I will. And Mrs. Calloway, thank you for seeing something in me I didn't know was there." "It was always there, Samuel. We just helped you see it too." The stage pulled away in a cloud of dust, and Nora felt Grant's arm come around her waist. They stood together watching until the stage disappeared over the horizon, taking Samuel Henderson toward a future none of them could have imagined 2 years ago. "Think he'll come back?" Grant asked quietly. "I don't know. Maybe he'll find opportunities out east that keep him there. But even if he doesn't come back, we've done something good. We've changed the trajectory of one life, and that matters." Grant kissed her temple. "Catherine would have loved this, loved you, the way you've taken her dream and made it bigger than either of us imagined." They walked back to the wagon, and Nora realized with a start that she'd stopped thinking of Catherine as a ghost haunting their marriage and started thinking of her as a friend she'd never met, but whose legacy she was honored to carry forward. The first Catherine had planted seeds of education and community care at Blue Mesa. The second Catherine, their daughter, would grow up in that garden, tended by both her mother's hands and her namesake's memory. The school year that followed was the best yet. Word had spread about Samuel's sponsorship, and suddenly parents were taking education more seriously. Students who'd been allowed to skip whenever they were needed for chores now showed up consistently. Fathers who'd been skeptical about book learning started asking about their children's progress. The school wasn't just a building anymore. It was becoming a cornerstone of the community. Nora hired Emma Martin, now 14 and frighteningly bright, as a part-time assistant. The girl came 3 afternoons a week to help with the younger students, and Nora could already see the makings of another teacher. Maybe Emma would be next, heading east for training with the Calloway's support. In October, a letter arrived from Samuel. He was thriving at normal school, though he admitted the work was harder than he'd expected. The other students came from educated families and had advantages Samuel lacked, but he was holding his own through sheer determination. His professors spoke well of him, he wrote. and he'd already been promised a position at a school in St. Louis upon graduation. Needn't, but I'm still planning to come back west, the letter concluded. Wyoming needs teachers, and I owe everything to folks there, especially to you and Mr. Calloway. I won't forget that. Nora read the letter aloud to Grant that evening while Catherine played on a blanket at their feet. Their daughter was nearly a year old now, pulling herself up on furniture and babbling constantly in her own private language. She had Grant's stubborn determination and Nora's serious eyes, and watching her explore her small world with fearless curiosity filled Nora with a joy so profound it was almost painful. "We did good," Grant said when she finished reading, giving that boy his chance. "We did." Nora set the letter aside and leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Sometimes I think about that woman I was before, standing on that platform, invisible and desperate, and I can't believe this is the same life." "It's not the same life. It's a better one we built together." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want to tell you something I've never told anyone." Nora waited, sensing this was important. "The day I rode to that gathering, I almost didn't go. Kept finding excuses, kept thinking Catherine wouldn't want me replacing her, kept believing I was better off alone." Grant's voice was low, thoughtful. "But the night before, I had a dream. Catherine was standing in that spot where we buried her, and she was angry. Told me I was being a coward, hiding from life because I was scared of losing again. Said she didn't raise me to be a coward." He laughed softly. "I woke up and knew I had to go. But I was still dragging my feet that morning. That's why I was late. Fixed a fence that could have waited. Checked on cattle that were fine, anything to delay. And then when I finally rode up and saw all those women," he paused. "I saw you standing at the back, and something in your expression made me think of Catherine, that same stubborn refusal to give up even when everything said you should. And I thought, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. I'm going to choose someone who deserves to be chosen." Nora's eyes burned. "You never told me that." "Didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. But it's the truth. You were meant to be here, Nora. At Blue Mesa, teaching these children, raising our daughter, being my wife. All of it was supposed to happen exactly the way it did." Catherine Rose chose that moment to let out a demanding wail, and they both laughed. Grant scooped her up and she immediately grabbed his nose with both hands, gurgling happily. "Your mother and I are having a moment," he told her seriously. "Could you be patient for 30 seconds? Catherine responded by blowing a raspberry, and Nora laughed so hard she cried. Years flowed like water after that, each season bringing its own rhythms and changes. Catherine Rose grew into a bright, curious child who spent her days in the schoolhouse watching her mother teach and absorbing knowledge like a sponge. By 3, she could read simple words. By 5, she was helping the youngest students with their letters, mimicking her mother's patient teaching style. Samuel Henderson returned from St. Louis in the spring of 1882, a certified teacher with a head full of new ideas and a determination to give back to the community that had given him his start. Copper Creek hired him to establish their first permanent school, and he threw himself into the work with a passion that made Nora proud. He visited Blue Mesa regularly, comparing notes with Nora about teaching methods and student progress, and more than once she caught him watching Emma Martin with an interest that had nothing to do with pedagogy. "He's sweet on her," Grant observed one evening after Samuel had stayed for supper. "She's only 17. But Catherine was 19 when I married her. Give it time." 2 years later, Samuel and Emma married in the same church where Grant and Nora had exchanged vows. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, and afterward Samuel pulled Nora aside with tears in his eyes. "None of this would have happened without you," he said. "Not my education, not my career, not Emma. You changed my entire life." "You changed your own life, Samuel. We just opened a door. You walked through it." The school at Blue Mesa continued to thrive. More families moved into the area, drawn by the availability of education, and soon Nora had nearly 40 students crammed into the little schoolhouse. Grant proposed building an addition, but Nora had a different idea. "What if we built a second school?" she suggested. "One for the older students, maybe in Copper Creek, where Samuel could help supervise. We could split the students by age, keep the young ones here where their parents can easily access them, send the older ones to town for more advanced work." Grant considered this, his expression thoughtful. It would mean hiring another teacher for here. Emma's trained now. She could take over the younger students here, and I could focus on the older ones in town. Or we could find someone else. There are more trained teachers coming west every year. They debated the logistics for weeks, but eventually the plan took shape. A second school was built in Copper Creek with funding from Grant, the Hendersons, and a dozen other families who'd watched their children flourish under Nora's teaching. Emma took over the Blue Mesa schoolhouse while Nora established the Copper Creek Academy for older students. The academy quickly became known throughout the territory. Nora taught advanced mathematics, science, literature, even a bit of Latin for students who wanted it. Her standards were high, and she accepted no excuses, but her students thrived under her demanding care. Several went on to universities back east. One became a doctor, another became a lawyer. And through it all, Nora and Grant's marriage deepened and strengthened. They had their difficult moments, arguments about money or time, or the constant pull of competing responsibilities. Once, during a particularly brutal winter, when Grant was gone for 3 weeks dealing with scattered cattle, Nora had locked herself in the bedroom and cried from sheer exhaustion and loneliness. But they always found their way back to each other. Grant learned to ask for help instead of carrying everything alone. Nora learned that being strong didn't mean never needing support. They learned the dance of partnership, sometimes graceful and sometimes clumsy, but always moving forward together. Catherine Rose grew into a remarkable young woman, fierce like her namesake, intelligent like her mother, solid and dependable like her father. She had no interest in ranching, but loved teaching, and by 16 she was already helping at the academy, showing the same gift for education that Samuel had displayed years earlier. More children came too, a son named Thomas when Catherine was 5, and twin girls Sarah and Margaret when Thomas was 3. The house at Blue Mesa filled with noise and chaos and love, and sometimes Nora would stand at the kitchen window watching her children play in the yard and feel overwhelmed by the fullness of her life. One evening in the spring of 1895, 17 years after that fateful bride gathering, Nora found herself standing at Catherine Calloway's grave for the first time in years. Grant still came regularly, but Nora had always given him that space as his own. Tonight, though, something drew her here. The grave was immaculate as always, fresh wildflowers scattered across the stone. Nora knelt beside it, her 48-year-old knees protesting slightly, and traced the carved letters with her finger. "Catherine," she said softly, feeling foolish talking to a headstone but needing to say the words anyway. "I never met you, but I've lived in your shadow for 17 years. I've slept in the bed you shared with Grant, raised a daughter who carries your name, taught in the school you dreamed of building, and for a long time I was terrified I could never measure up to your memory." She paused, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods. "But I've realized something. You didn't want me to measure up to you. You wanted Grant to be happy. You wanted this land to have a school. You wanted children to have chances they wouldn't have otherwise. And all of that has happened. So maybe, wherever you are, you're satisfied." "She is." Nora turned to find Grant standing a few yards away, his silver hair gleaming in the twilight. He was 63 now, his face deeply lined and his hands gnarled by decades of hard work, but his storm-gray eyes were still sharp and clear. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough." He came to kneel beside her, groaning as his knees protested. "Getting old, Nora." "We both are." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, and then Grant said, "Catherine came to me in a dream last night. First time in years. She was standing right here, looking exactly like she did at 25. And you know what she said?" "What?" "She said, 'You did good, Grant. Better than I hoped.' And then she looked at me with this smile and said, 'I'm glad you chose her. She's made you happier than I ever could have.'" Nora's breath caught. "Grant, it's true." He took her hand, pressing it to his heart. "What you and I have, it's different from what Catherine and I had. But it's no less real, no less deep. Maybe even more so because we've had years to build it. Years to learn each other, to weather storms, to choose each other every single day." He turned to face her fully. "Nora, you took a broken man and a dying dream and turned them both into something beautiful. This ranch, this school, these children, All of it exists because you were brave enough to say yes to a stranger who chose you on a platform 17 years ago. You chose me, Nora whispered, when no one else would. Best decision I ever made. Grant pulled her close, and they sat there beside Catherine's grave as darkness fell, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built a life worth living. Catherine Rose found them there an hour later, bringing blankets because the night had turned cold. At 19, she was beautiful and brilliant, with offers to attend university in Chicago or Boston. But she'd told her parents she wanted to stay, wanted to teach in Wyoming where teachers were desperately needed. "What are you two doing out here?" she asked, spreading a blanket around their shoulders. "Remembering," Grant said, "and being grateful." Catherine Rose settled beside them, and the three of them sat together under the stars. Eventually, Thomas and the twins joined them, drawn by some invisible family magnet, and they sat in a cluster beside the grave of the woman who'd started it all. "Tell us about her," young Margaret asked. At 12, she was endlessly curious about the aunt she'd been named for, about the first Catherine. So Grant told stories as the stars wheeled overhead, stories of a fierce woman who'd come west seeking adventure and found partnership instead, who'd taught cowboys to read and dreamed of schools that would change children's lives, who'd loved with her whole heart and left a legacy that still echoed through the valley. And Nora added her own stories about a desperate woman on her 7th attempt at marriage who'd been chosen by a man who saw her worth, about building a life from shared dreams and stubborn hope, about learning that family isn't just blood but also choice and commitment, and showing up every day to do the work of love. The children listened, and Nora saw understanding dawn in their eyes. They were the fruit of two loves, two Catherines, two different kinds of courage. They were living proof that second chances were real, that being passed over 6 times didn't mean you weren't worthy, that sometimes the best things in life came from refusing to give up. As the night deepened and the children drifted back to the house, Grant and Nora remained. They'd spent 17 years together, building something real and lasting from the raw materials of grief and hope. They'd raised 4 children, educated dozens more, transformed a lonely ranch into a thriving home. They'd loved each other through hard winters and difficult seasons, through loss and joy, and the simple daily work of choosing partnership. "Do you ever regret it?" Grant asked suddenly. "Saying yes that night? Taking on all of this?" Nora thought about the exhaustion, the struggle, the moments when she'd felt overwhelmed and inadequate. She thought about Catherine's ghost and the weight of expectations and the fear that had dogged her for years that she'd never be enough. And then she thought about student faces lighting up when they mastered a new concept, about Samuel Henderson teaching his own classroom now, passing forward the gift he'd been given, about Catherine Rose following in her footsteps, about Grant's hand in hers every night, solid and sure, about a life filled with purpose and meaning and love that had surprised her with its depth. "Not for a single second," she said. "Every rejection before you led me to exactly where I was supposed to be. Every no was just clearing the path for your yes." Grant pulled her close, and they sat together in the darkness, while Wyoming stretched vast and eternal around them. Above, the stars burned bright and cold, the same stars that had watched a desperate woman stand on a platform and a late-riding cowboy choose her in front of everyone, the same stars that had blessed a marriage built on practicality and hope, that had witnessed the birth of children and the building of schools and the slow transformation of 2 lonely people into partners. "Thank you," Grant whispered into her hair, "for being brave enough to stand on that platform one more time, for saying yes when you could have said no, for building this life with me." "Thank you for seeing me," Nora replied, "for choosing me when I was invisible to everyone else, for giving me a life that matters." They kissed there beside Catherine's grave, a testament to the strange and beautiful truth that hearts can hold multiple loves, that new beginnings don't erase the past but build upon it, that sometimes the most unexpected choices lead to the most extraordinary lives. And as they finally walked back to the house hand in hand, the windows glowing warm with lamplight and the sounds of their children's laughter drifting on the wind, Nora Ellison Calloway knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The house welcomed them home, as it had for 17 years. as it would for years to come, long after Grant's hair had gone completely silver and Nora's hands had grown stiff with age. Long after their children had grown and scattered to build their own lives, carrying forward the lessons about education and kindness and refusing to give up that they'd learned at Blue Mesa Ranch. The legacy of two Catherines, one who'd dreamed it, one who'd lived it, would echo through the Wyoming territory for generations. Children who'd been taught to read would teach their own children. Teachers inspired by Nora's example would open schools in frontier towns across the West. The ripples would spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined that day, when a dusty cowboy rode onto a platform and chose the woman everyone else had overlooked. But that night, in the quiet of their bedroom with moonlight streaming through the windows, Grant and Nora simply held each other and marveled at the strange grace that had brought them together. Two people who'd been looking for something, anything, to make their lives meaningful, had found each other and built something that mattered. "I love you," Grant murmured as sleep began to claim them. "I love you too," Nora whispered back. "Every day I choose you. Every single day." And that, in the end, was the real story. Not about a mail-order bride gathering or a dramatic public choice, though those things had happened. Not even about building schools or raising children or transforming a community, though they'd done all that too. The real story was about two people who'd chosen each other every single day for 17 years, who'd built a partnership strong enough to weather any storm, who'd proven that second chances were real and that being chosen once was enough if you made the choice matter. The wind whispered through the Wyoming night, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, and coyotes sang their ancient songs. Inside the house at Blue Mesa Ranch, a family slept peacefully, safe in the knowledge that they were loved, that they belonged, that they were home. And if you'd asked Nora in that moment what she thought about that woman who'd stood on platform after platform being rejected, who'd almost given up, who'd tried one last desperate time, she would have told you that woman had been exactly as strong as she needed to be, that every no had been preparing her for the yes that would change everything. She would have told you that sometimes the best things in life come to those who refuse to quit, even when quitting seems like the only sensible option. That being overlooked isn't the same as being unworthy, that the right person will see you, really see you, when everyone else looks past. But mostly, she would have told you about a cowboy who arrived late to a gathering and chose her anyway, about a hand held in front of a crowd, a proposal under cottonwood trees, a life built from hope and hard work, and the stubborn belief that everyone deserves to be chosen. And she would have told you that the seventh time was indeed the charm, and that second chances, when they finally came, were worth every moment of waiting. The night deepened around Blue Mesa Ranch, and inside Nora Ellison Calloway smiled in her sleep, her hand clasped tight in her husband's, and dreamed of wildflowers blooming after rain.